All right, everybody. Welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast, Part 2. Alex O'Connor versus Trent Horn, laying out, their debate. I'm going to react to it. I might be sometimes a little more long-winded than others when I'm explaining interesting things that I found out over the past 8 years of doing Myth Vision that might be useful to a lot of people who are watching this apologetic debate that's been going on for quite some time. We've been listening to people like William Lane Craig. Ravi Zacharias was doing some of this, but not on the level that William Lane Craig was in the debate arena. Frank Turek, people like that have been, really pushing these apologetics online for a long time and through DVDs before YouTube was a thing. I used to watch it. I used to hook, line, and sinker, just buy everything that they were selling. And as you start to read more primary sources, patristics, scholars that are critical, who know the languages, other material at the same time that the Gospels are written to get an idea of how people thought about things, whether it be Jewish literature or non-Jewish literature, you start to realize the complexity. You start to recognize that there's a lot here that needs to be understood. And even like when Trent Horn at the beginning of the debate brings out, well, Paul's a Pharisee, that becomes a talking point. Paul's a Pharisee, therefore, because I can quote Josephus, who says the Pharisees believed in a resurrection from the dead, that automatically means that the body that gets buried is also the same body that resurrects from the dead in Paul. And therefore, Paul has a physical bodily resurrection from the dead. Not realizing that Jews obviously don't agree with each other on almost anything often. Just go read the Talmud and you'll find out how many rabbis disagree with rabbis. And they're very rabbinic. They're very much in the vein of the Pharisees in their thinking. And they don't agree on all sorts of stuff all the time. Paul's engaging people who have a different view on what to do with Gentiles than him. There's a lot of stuff that is up for grabs. And I think the more we learn about the philosophy, the history, comparing it to other literature and stuff, the more we'll have a better grasp on what's going on. So we're picking up where we left off. I'm looking forward to this. Let's do a quick little intro. I don't want to go too long, but why not? If you're watching this later, like, share, comment down below, and subscribe. Here we go.
Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.
All right. So, little intro, giving people just a little bit more time before we start hitting play and continuing with Alex O'Connor. I put together something I think would be pretty interesting to show you before we even begin. We're rehashing yesterday. If you missed yesterday's live stream, you can check this out and then go watch. And what I'm going to show you hopefully will give you a little more clarity. I went and looked up Gregory J. Riley's book here, Cosmology and Self in Apostle Paul, and was wanting to surf through the material because I have the e-version and I wanted to surf through and say, hey, show me, help me understand what this guy's argument is ultimately using Google Notebook LM, right? You can find out, like using Notebook LM, you can go through books, hundreds of pages, and easily find the sections you're looking for. And so I had created this cool little timeline to help people understand from spirit to flesh. Paul talks about the last Adam being a life-giving pneuma, spirit. He is not flesh. Flesh and blood does not inherit the kingdom of God. Trent Horn's whole model is that that's a Semitism. To get out of the pickle of Paul's theology, that's a Semitism. Why is it that Jesus is holding fish and eating fish and telling Thomas to touch his body, touch his wounds so that he's convinced? Well, and it's not just this scholar here, Greg Gregory J. Riley, who wrote this, but also Elaine Pagels, whom I've interviewed several times about this topic. That is that the Gospel of John is reacting to the Gospel of Thomas. There are other scholars too, by the way, who think that Thomas is pretty early. Early being maybe 90s, maybe 100, maybe 110. Like the Gospel of Thomas may be that early. Okay. Some scholars suggest that. Others think it's later. That's fine. There's a debate. So this, I'm wondering if I could zoom in a little bit better for you here. So the question is, did the earliest Christians believe Jesus rose with the same body of flesh and bone that hung on the cross, or did the bodily fish-eating, wound-bearing Jesus of Luke and John develop later as the church defended itself against alternative Christologies that read Paul's pneumatic language straightforwardly? The pattern in the New Testament is unmistakable to anyone who reads the text in chronological order. Paul, our earliest witness, writes of soma pneumaticon, a body of spirit substance distinct from the corpse that was sown. Mark, our earliest gospel, ends with an empty tomb and no appearances at all. Matthew, and this is where I think serious hyper-apologetic mode is kicking in, Matthew adds a brief mountain experience, but also like the tomb is sealed, the angel has to roll it away in front of the women, you got guards there, and they have to say that they stole the body. Like, there's all sorts of stuff going on. Luke gives us a Jesus who eats broiled fish. John gives us Thomas, invited to touch the wounds. So here's a little timeline, okay? Roughly Paul's letter, specifically 1 Corinthians, Philippians 3, 2 Corinthians 5, usually the consensus dates at around 53 to 56. And this is the earliest writing on resurrection, and it insists on transformation, not revivication. Paul contrasts the soma physicon, the natural body that is sown, with the soma pneumaticon, the spiritual body that is raised. The body of humiliation is exchanged for the body of glory. Paul says, it is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. He lists his own visionary encounter. That's actually in Acts, so I wouldn't necessarily mention the specific encounter happening in Damascus, but in 1 Corinthians 15, he does list himself and his appearances of the risen Christ in the same category with Cephas and James and the 12 and the 500. These are in unambiguously, and there's many scholars who've pointed this out, visionary experiences. So the development happens, right? Okay, now we get to Gospel of Mark. Before, we're going to react here in just a moment to the debate, continuing, but I think this is important. Empty tomb, silent women. Earliest gospel ends without a single resurrection appearance. The women find the tomb empty. A young man tells them Jesus has been raised and will be seen in Galilee. Many scholars take this raised to be an assumption to heaven. A lot of them take it as he's already been assumed to heaven. A lot of scholars think that that's how Mark should be written. But he goes on, the women flee in terror and tell no one. I was reading yesterday and comparing it to Matthew. Immediately the women go and tell the disciples. So Matthew's already contradicting Mark. The women flee in terror and say nothing to anyone. Matthew says, oh, yep, they scream and yell to the disciples. Already fixing the problem. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. No fish, no wounds touched, no walking through walls, no conversation. The post-resurrection physical interaction that fills later gospels is entirely absent from the earliest one. Whatever Mark's community knew or believed about the appearances, the gospel does not show them. Now we're talking Matthew, roughly. I mean, mind you, these dates are not concrete. Mark could be written later. Some have even suggested earlier, but I think there's evidence in Mark, at least there might be material in them that are earlier, but there's good reason to think that Mark's written after the war. Matthew, they put roughly 80 to 90. Could be later. You never know. Matthew adds two brief appearances to Mark's empty tomb. The women encounter Jesus on the road and grasp his feet. The 11 meet him on a mountain in Galilee where some worship and some doubt. We looked at that yesterday. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Well, that's kind of hard to do with the physical, bodily, resurrected Jesus in the flesh saying, this is me, dude. You guys know I died. Touch me. Look at me, guys. I'm here. I doubt they're going to doubt unless it's visionary. And then at that point, you might be wondering, what is this? As Alex O'Connor pointed out yesterday, in the Mount of Transfiguration scene, they're like in this kind of in-between slumber state. Is this a memory of like meditating on a hill, and the disciples think they saw a vision of the Lord in some way, of Jesus after the resurrection? Or is this literary, as I highlight by looking at people like Romulus? Romulus, they literally tell a story where Romulus appears after being assumption to heaven, right? He's gone to heaven. His name is Quirinius. He's a god. He comes back and gives a great commission to Julius Proculus. And in that great commission, tell the whole Roman world, fight. And of course, he tells this trustworthy person to go and tell them what he had seen and what he was told by Romulus after that. So anyway, the physical contact is minimal. Feet are clasped. The mountain appearance does not include eating, conversation about the body, or invitations to touch wounds. Strikingly, even with the risen Jesus present before them, some of the disciples doubt. Now, I don't know what to do with the date of Thomas, simply saying there are scholars who've dated it to 90 to 120. And a rival Christology preserved at Nag Hammadi presents Jesus not as a fleshly figure who died and rose, but as the living one whose teachings convey eternal life to those who interpret them rightly. Thomas opens with the words, "Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death." Jesus said, "I am the light that is over all things. I am all. From me all came forth, and to me all attained. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there." Gospel of Thomas, saying 77. Thomas Christianity has no resurrection narrative because it needs none. The risen Jesus and the teaching Jesus are the same Jesus, accessible through gnosis. There's no empty tomb, no appearance stories. There is no insistence on fleshly continuity. This is exactly the Christology that the canonical Gospels, particularly John, were positioned against. And that's, to this scholar, Gregory J. Riley and Elaine Pagel's book on the Gnostics, so Gnostic material. Now, we get to Luke. I put 100 to 140 because I've made the case and have had several scholars continue to grow. There's a growing number of academics who recognize that Luke Acts, knows Josephus. Josephus, his work on antiquities was published in 93 AD, 93, 94. Give it 6 years at least, and you're at 100. So from the publication of his antiquities to 100 is only 6 years. That's being pretty, I would say, conservative about this author having access to Josephus's work on antiquities. And it's a massive book, 20 books, right? So whoever's copying this, and copies of it are now being spread out, give it 6 years to at least put Luke Acts at least to 100. There are other reasons to date it later that Richard Purvo and others have highlighted. Anyway, Luke transforms the resurrection appearances into elaborate physical demonstrations. The road to Emmaus involves a walking, talking, bread-breaking Jesus whose recognition is delayed. This is important. We covered this yesterday with Bruce Loudon, highlighting how this scene, the road to Emmaus scene, is mythology. It is fictive. It is a theoxany and a xenia motif. Xenia being hospitality, theoxany as in a disguised, hidden recognition scene where God is hiding its identity and then reveals it to the protagonist in the story. That is what's happening in the story to the road to Emmaus. And in this story, apologists love to use the scene where he breaks bread, showing his physicality of his body. He breaks bread, though he's hidden identity. They use that, go, see, he's physical in Luke. The Jerusalem appearance escalates further. Jesus shows his hands and feet, invites the disciples to handle him, and pointedly asks for food. See my hands and my feet? That is I myself. Handle me and see. For a spirit has not flesh and bones as you see that I have. Flesh and bones. Remember Paul? Flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom of God. Lots of scholars look at this and go, whoa, Luke's doing something contrary to Paul. He's breaking Paul's idea earlier. And while still disbelieved for joy and wondered, he said to them, having you anything here to eat? They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate before them. Luke 24. Note what Luke explicitly denies: a spirit, pneuma. Note what he explicitly affirms: flesh and bones, the eating of fish. This is no longer pneumatic. This is meat. The Lucan Jesus is constructed against precisely the kind of pneumatic understanding Paul articulated and against the spiritualist Christologies emerging in the late first and early second centuries. The Daniel A. Smith argument is that Luke is anchoring an originally translation-style narrative in concrete physical evidence. And then, lastly, Gospel of John. This one always intrigues me, that Thomas is the key figure, where Thomas in John, if you read it carefully, I even had Mark Goodacre questioning this again. He's like, I don't know what to do with this. If you just look at the character Thomas, then open up the Gospel of Thomas and start looking at them and go, man, Thomas Didymus, Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas, the twin of Jesus, one who is on equal status through gnosis with Jesus, with the Christ, meaning anyone can be Thomas Didymus. That's this theology that people don't like, right? And we're about to get to the Alex O'Connor thing. So I just want to get this in your brain while we're here. John's gospel takes the apologetic intensification to its sharpest point. Thomas, missing from the first appearance, refuses to believe unless he can place his finger in the wounds. Jesus appears a week later and offers exactly this. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not be faithless, but believing. John 20. Gregory Riley argues in Resurrection Reconsidered, this entire pericope is constructed as polemic against the Thomas Christian community. The named doubter is precisely the figure venerated by the rival tradition. By having Thomas himself capitulate to the physical model and confess Jesus as my Lord and my God, John is performing a textual conquest. The Thomas who in his own gospel transmitted Jesus as saying that whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death is here forced to abandon spiritualist Christology and embrace fleshly resurrection. Of course, Elaine Pagels develops this further in Beyond Belief. John, she argues, was written in deliberate opposition to the Thomas community, spiritualizing Christology, the wound touching, the breath giving, the eating of the breakfast on the shore in chapter 21. Every physical detail is doing polemical work. And I love that. By the way, if you're looking for Ignatius, he's already competing against these ideas. I was asking one of my scholar friends about dating Ignatius. They didn't get back to me because some scholars probably date this later. But either way you put it, here's where the consensus, I think, of Ignatius lands roughly. And it talks about, for I knew and believed that he was in the flesh even after the resurrection. The people who deny that he was in the flesh after the resurrection, they're antichrists. And you have Polycarp, of course, continuing this too. For everyone who does not confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is antichrist, building upon this idea. And there you have it. All right. One little comment about that Elaine Pagels thing is this. Not only is Thomas the doubter, which you could look at it in a positive light, but you can look at it in a negative light. Like the story is trying to say, Thomas has to doubt. The other guys, they believe, but he doesn't want to believe. He's doubtful. Then when he goes to give the Holy Spirit to the disciples, Thomas is not present in the room. So when he breathes the Holy Spirit upon the disciples, Thomas doesn't get it. That, I think, is a huge problem. Okay, did I lose you? I feel like my audio went out for a second. Huh. Hold on. Let me Okay, studio display. I'm thinking my audio sound is back. The problem is it's terrible audio built in through the mic. Let me it's built into the computer screen. I don't know what the heck happened. Bear with me 1 second. Bear with me. There, that's probably why. I think I somehow hit the audio. Let's get this back on. My audio should be better now. I think I hit this thing in front of me while we were talking there. Okay. So yeah, he doesn't get the Holy Spirit in John. Kind of seems like a jab at Thomas. Now, Mark Goodacre thinks Thomas was written after John. Elaine Pagels, Gregory Riley, and others think, no, John is a reaction to Thomas. You hear apologists all the time, like Wesley Huff, say, Thomas is late. It's all late. Nag Hammadi stuff is late, as if the tradition of these materials don't go back early. They want to do as early as they can for the canonical stuff. They don't like that Gnostic stuff. They don't like that other alternative stuff to be early as well. And I think that's silly. I think it's not. I think that they're doing that intentionally. All right. Now, is my audio good? Everybody press 1, please, so I don't look like I'm a fool sitting here talking forever. Yeah, you're here for Matthew, you're here for a live. Trent Horn won because Alex did not debate the issue. He basically argued for Mormonism. I don't think you understand why Mormonism got brought up and why using a heuristic approach for an alternative movement becomes a perfect model, because he clearly doesn't believe Mormonism's true. He's using it to show a comparison to Christianity, as I do all the time with mythology. And of course, they go, well, correlation never equals causation. And then they bring the Titanic analogy. And then it's like, oh my God, now you got to talk about the Titan, which was a fiction about the futility fiction about a novel of a boat that goes sinking. And there's a lot of parallels with the Titanic and stuff. And they use these kinds of things to make you think, you can't use comparative mythology and stuff or other examples of cults to Christianity to help weaponize against the argument of the resurrection or its claims. And I think that that's a mistake. We are hashing. Damn, I didn't bring any hash. You know, you should go get some. What is up, Angie? All right, I got a 1 in here. I got a few ones. Got a 1. I got a 1. I got a uno. I got a 6. Awesome. Okay, audio's good. Let's check out Alex O'Connor now. I wanted to lay that out because yesterday just went into this blindly, just saying, let's see what's up. And there was a lot covered, but let's continue. Let me know you can hear it in the chat.
I can believe, but I wouldn't.
Let me put my audio here. There we go.
Would not be able to be convinced that it was you if it were not physically stood in front of me. Yet some of those.
Why is my audio not right? Bear with me here.
Disciples doubted. Whereas if I had some kind of visionary experience with a few other people and some said, I think that was John come back, I might say, you know what, I'm not sure about that, guys. Yeah. In other words, I think there are some hints there, but I don't know. That's a lot, and it's not really a point. Maybe Trent can expertly sieve out whatever points I might have made in there and see what he has to say to them.
Yeah, Trent, where would you like to take this?
I have a lot, so I think it's always prudent to work backwards from what we just heard, and we'll go back through a lot of the points that Alex raised. So when it comes to the transfiguration, I think that was a physical historical event. And I do think it's interesting that it's Moses and Elijah, because Elijah, the previous narrative in the Old Testament, said he was assumed bodily into heaven. Mm-hmm. But there's also Jewish tradition that Moses's body was taken into heaven.
Yeah.
Jude chapter 9 refers to the dispute between the archangel Gabriel and the devil over Moses's body. There's extra testamental evidence to a belief that Moses had also been taken up into heaven.
I think Philo talks about it.
Right. So I think that there could be evidence that, I think that holy people can be assumed into heaven. Moses, Elijah. As a Catholic, I think the Blessed Virgin Mary is up there bodily, which also explains these apparitions as well, or these appearances. So I think that's not problematic for me. And especially that Peter says, I want to build you tents. If you just see a vision of somebody in the sky, I find it interesting that if we're just making a grand theological investigation, what's interesting here is I like to compare that to, okay, well, when do we see myth making? What does it look like? When you read like the Gospel of Peter, for example, when people go on an absolute myth making binge, it's really, really over the top. That's from probably mid 2nd century. And you have all the Romans at the tomb, all of the Jews, the angels come down. They come out of the tomb. They're giants. Jesus comes out. He's like 500 feet tall. So that's a lot different than the more sober accounts, especially like what we see in Mark. So it's kind of funny.
It's funny. I got to pause and just say this. It's funny what's sober to him. Now, don't get me wrong. There is more sober. If you're comparing wild to less wild, okay. But like, what about the garden scene in John, right? Where exactly is this at? They fall as dead in John's garden scene. I can't remember if this is John 18. Yeah, John 18. Okay, so let me pull up Cross Bible here. Let me refresh this. I think it's worth I'll just read it. I don't have to pull it up because then I'd have to take down the video real quick here and then switch it over. So in John 18, we're going there now. I mean, I'm reading this and I'm going, that's pretty, that sounds pretty mythical. Like, that sounds like radical. That does not sound like something that sounds exaggerated, like something you would hear him talk about the Gospel of Peter or some other text that seems to be. Now, clearly that one goes beyond. It's got a walking, talking cross, which, by the way, some scholars think it may have been misunderstood to mean that. Whom are you looking for? Jesus says. They answered, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus replied, I am he. Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, I am he, ego eimi, I'm not sure the he, they stepped back and fell to the ground. Mind you, it's a whole, a detachment of soldiers. There's from my understanding, I think 500. Let me double check. How many soldiers approximately fell as dead? Let's see. So estimated 300 to 600 soldiers. So Jesus says, I am he, and estimated 300 to 600 soldiers fall as if they were dead. That doesn't sound very sober to me. Just keeping it real with you. It sounds like what you're getting in the Gospel of Thomas in many ways. And you can point to other examples where it sounds a bit fantastic in the gospel material, in Acts, in these different stories. So yeah, you can look to more radical stuff. And if you're comparing the most radical to less radical, it's still radical though. All right, continue.
That Mark's a bit more sober. We say, oh, well, he doesn't have all these appearances. Then if he did have a bunch, you'd say, that would just be a bunch of myth making. So I worry if that's kind of...
Well, Mark just is not as elaborated. There's a growing tradition that is being a bit more exaggerative over time, but it's still, he got him calming the sea. You've got him walking on water. You've got him casting 2,000 swine into the ocean by a demon named demoniac, or not demoniac, legion. You do have exaggeration, even if it isn't as exaggerated. Like, you would almost imagine him arguing for Q or something. Like, then you could get back to a much less exaggerated gospel, and that's not what we see. I think he's just coming at the skeptic for this.
And a catch 22 there. I would say Mark is very clear.
Can I ask you, Trent, a clarifying question on that? Because, I mean, do you see apologetic features within the canonical gospel narratives themselves? You know, it's often pointed out, for example, that Matthew and Luke have a new tomb in which no one was laid, or John, a new tomb in which no one was laid. So, so do you find those same features within the Gospels, but it's just in a more sober form?
Yes, but just because there is an apologetic, it doesn't follow that it's a hollow defense or con artistry or trying to defend that which is false. Like Matthew very clearly describes an apologetic polemic that had been going on between Christians and Jews for some time about debating what happened to Jesus's body, with the Jews of his time arguing that the body had been stolen. And then
Dude, I love I really wish Alex had more time to elaborate what he thinks is going on there, because he probably thinks a lot like me here. There's so much that could be said between Mark and Matthew, and what Matthew is doing that Mark doesn't do. And you can read between the lines the apologetic moves that Matthew's making that just makes me laugh. It makes me just go, what is going on here? There should be serious doubts about trusting this material when you go from Mark to Matthew. You don't even need John and Luke, which get really even beyond that in terms of their elaboration of detail. But looking at Alex's face, like, like he has a lot to say, I'm sure, about it.
The Christians saying, no, it wasn't, and because there were guards and other things like that, which shows that the apologetic there does show there's a missing body. The Jews just didn't say, oh, he was thrown into a pit. He was devoured by the dogs because of the dog he was. We don't see them making that kind of argument. So there's an apologetic, but it can reveal truths that are helpful to the case we're making. Let me go quick.
Think about this too. I mean, he's doing so many hypotheticals, but like if Matthew is working off Mark doesn't say he was cast into a common grave. And if there were Jewish traditions, which I think there were, Celsus or Celsus, however you want to pronounce the philosopher that's criticizing Christianity in the 2nd century, he knows Jewish traditions that believe that Jesus or the disciples stole the body. He works with these Jewish ideas in his writings. He talks about this. But like to argue like, well, they would have just said he was cast to the dogs because he was a dog. And that would maybe work if you didn't already have a gospel that Matthew's literally borrowing from. And what if Jews are hearing about these stories and they are the ones who are then concocting an apologetic against this earlier tradition, or vice versa? These are all hypotheticals. Maybe there was already a known tradition. Mark wasn't concerned with it. Matthew goes, we've got to deal with this. Let's add some guards. Let's do this. Let's do that. That Mark doesn't do. They want to try and smash the idea that they stole the body. I just don't know why throwing him in like the argument, throwing him to the dogs because he was a dog would even work when we're dealing with Mark, which is being copied by Matthew. I don't know.
Through some of the other things that Alex raised though about Paul's physical body, I would say when Paul uses the Greek word soma, so in Philippians 3:21, I don't recall if I said physical, I said transformed to be like his glorious body. I did say that.
No, you did say physical, dude. We paused it last video. Go watch it and replay it. But either way, I don't want to get like caught up being pedantic about accidentally saying words. But the fact that he did say physical tells me where his mind is going, because he's starting with John and Luke's idea of eating fish and touching his body with Thomas and stuff, and the breaking of bread with the road to Emmaus as an apologetic point to say that same body is the same coherent idea that all of the early Christians, including Paul, had. So he's trying to create a harmonious idea about the resurrected body of Jesus. Anyway, let's hear him.
The word soma, when Paul uses soma, he always uses it to refer to a physical body, something with corporeal form. So he doesn't use suke or soul.
Yeah, but he's not talking about flesh and blood. Paul says flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom of God. We went over this. Pneuma, which is often understood as wind or breath, is often by philosophers at the time, Middle Platonists and Stoics and stuff, as either fire, the element of fire. The sun was made of this, by the way, by some philosophers. They did think the sun was made of fire, but also of ether. So it's made of a physical substance, but it is not flesh and blood. Then Luke comes along and talks about flesh and bone. So something's changed between Paul's teaching and Luke's. Something's changed. Scholars like Gregory J. Riley, I brought up earlier, Elaine Pagels, others have seen, they think that there's a growing combat, apologetic combat against other Christian movements over time, and they're physicalizing the body to become more body like what we see, flesh and blood or flesh and bone.
Or anything like that to describe what we will be. He always uses that more firmer word soma. When it comes to the stigmata, I think I lean towards Augustine there, that I think it's been poetically put that the only man-made thing in heaven will be the wounds of the crucifixion on Christ. And so I think that would really stand to, that this is how Christ triumphed over death and was able to show, yes, it is I, it is not someone else. It is not some kind of a duplicate. I am the same person, body and soul, who was crucified, who stands before you now.
Which wounds do you think he'll have?
What wounds will he have?
Yeah.
I think that there's the 5 sacred wounds. They've talked about the wounds in the feet, the hands or wrists, and possibly abrasions around the head. But when it comes to speculating what heaven will be like and what my Savior will be like when I meet him, I don't like to speculate too much. I leave that one up to him. When it comes to, though, the physical, so a lot of this, though, it comes to...
By the way, side note, there are many heroes that have appeared, of course, in pneumatic bodies. They're not physical flesh and bone. In fact, when you'd go to touch, they'd often be ghostly. You get this in like Visitations to Hades and stuff. They're like they're you almost want to say like they're ghost in a sense, right? Which you see the Gospels try to push against this idea. They would show their wounds often, like the wound that caused their death. You could see their wounds often reflected in their bodies after. So, by the way, this is just the ancient world is full of this stuff, all sorts of ideas that humans have. But he's like, can't wait to meet Jesus in heaven, who's going to have stigmata and all this kind of stuff. But he doesn't want to speculate too much.
Let's say, okay, you're saying, well, we got Paul, he's got the appearances. How do we know this wasn't just hallucination? That's where I depart from the mental facts people and saying, I think especially like Luke's description of these group appearances, I think Luke is a very reliable source when talking about things. So for example, just because something's recorded only in one place, it doesn't mean that's, it didn't happen anywhere else. So for example, in AD 41, the Emperor Claudius expelled a bunch of Jews from the city of Rome. What's interesting is that Josephus and Tacitus don't record this event. It's only recorded in two places. Suetonius, who says they did that because of Chrestus, which might mean they were fighting about Christ, and Luke. In Acts 18:2, it's an offhand reference to it when he meets Priscilla and Aquila. Just very offhand reference. But a lot of times Luke makes these kind of offhand things, and they're 100% historically accurate. Colin Hemer's book, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History.
Hold on. Colin Hemer's... Hold on. What source is this? Because I want to go actually fact check this, and I won't be able to do that during this stream. Back this up just a smidge.
It's an offhand reference to it when he meets Priscilla and Aquila. Just very offhand reference. But a lot of times Luke makes these kind of offhand things, and they're 100% historically accurate. Colin Hemer's book, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History, goes through that a lot. So I think I have good evidence in that.
The Book of Acts and...
reference. But a lot of times Luke makes these kind of offhand things, and they're 100% historically accurate. Colin Hemer's book, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History, goes through that a lot. So I think I have good evidence in that also.
The setting of Hellenistic... I think he said history. I could be wrong, but I'll find that out. Anyway, I want to get this source myself and go check this out because there's a lot of stuff Luke doesn't get right historically. There's a lot of stuff that is mistaken in Luke Acts. So we just fundamentally approach the book of Luke, books of Luke and Acts differently. I don't think that, everything he's putting in there is on spot, but I'm interested in this point he says about Suetonius and Luke Acts having this mention of expelling Jews, but that it doesn't get a mention anywhere else. I need to look into that. I haven't looked into that when I was preparing for the debate about Luke Acts' dependence upon Josephus, but I would be happy to see that. And I don't deny that Luke Acts probably has sources that are beyond just Josephus.
Luke it was a traveling companion of Paul. I think that's very clear. So we get that helps back up, Paul's conversion experience, and that this wasn't just a private vision. People with him saw something, not the whole thing.
But not a bodily Christ, right?
Why? I don't know. He hears a voice. He says, who is it that I'm speaking to? Is I am Jesus who you're persecuting. But it seems that Paul compares him, and he says in 1 Corinthians 9, have I not seen Jesus our Lord?
He does.
He compares his encounter to Jesus in 1 Corinthians 15 to these other appearances that are physical appearances. Yeah. And when he says this to one untimely born, I think that's a reference to that after Pentecost, this period. Here's what's interesting, Alex, is like we don't have a bunch of other Jesus appearances. They stop basically. So I think Paul is saying that he had an encounter like the apostles, but it was unusually late for him to be given. Which I think also for me, it shows this is very interesting that if you had a bunch of hopped up religious believers in the first century, I would have expected the apostles in their letters. It's always funny to see what they complain about kind of indirectly reveals what's really going on here. I would expect them to say like, hey, these people claim Jesus spoke to them and said this. No. He only appeared to us. Don't run around with them, because we even have people today, right, who say that Jesus appeared to them and told them stuff.
Quite.
So it's striking to me that problem is not.
I don't know, like, how much material. This assumes there's so much material that we should see. And there were people who were experiencing the Christ, who were having these kind of revelatory experiences beyond just Paul. I think that it's unfortunate. Most of it is not preserved. If not, a lot of it has been not copied or intentionally removed, right? That they had no interest in keeping it. We only have a lot of this stuff through the writings of heresiologists. But I remember interviewing M. David Litlow recently talking about Simon Magus in the book of Acts, and the material in there that he himself acts as though he's part of the Christ movement. He's been baptized. And this guy is also, like Paul, doing his own ministry thing. And then what do? They make a propagandistic thing saying, oh, you tried to buy the Holy Spirit. This guy himself thinks he's somehow connected to this, but he's not one of the 12. He doesn't appear on the list of 1 Corinthians 15. That list, by the way, in 1 Corinthians 15, where did it come from? And how do we know where that came from? Paul adds his name to this list. Later on, I untimely born. But the other thing that I'm sure Alex is nodding to is that we both would probably agree, if you grant that list as actually a historical memory of something that people were having visionary experiences early on, mystical, dreams, maybe meditative states, traumatic, whatever you want to call it, something that they wanted to then equate with the Lord. Paul is also having the same kind of visionary experience. Trent's taking that further, doing what I've heard William Lane Craig do, and acting like the body was physical, and that Paul saw literally the flesh and blood body of Jesus in the actual body you see described in Luke and John. Whereas Acts paints it as a vivid light that blinds Paul. And then, you get contradictory account later in Acts. And did the people hear it, or did they see it? Or, it's a mess. But I know Alex is going, yeah. So they fundamentally disagree already.
In the first century church, with a bunch of fervent believers, there's an understanding of it being just this kind of historical reality, just for the apostles. Finally, about the Mormon stuff and the dying, Peter, Paul, and I want to just cover that because I worked backwards from what you said. Yeah. I agree with you. The argument, who would die for a lie, is a horribly bad one. It's a horrible argument.
Thank you.
Because Muslim suicide bombers do that all the time. The Tamil Tigers. There's people who die for things that are a lie all the time. The greater question is, who would die for something that they know is a lie?
Lots of people. I'm glad he brought this up. I had a talk. James Fodor came on, and we were discussing this very issue. How many times have we watched true crime episodes where the criminal who committed the crime, all the evidence points to them, and they still plead innocent? They don't plead guilty. They go and get life in prison, and they still deny it, knowing that they're wrong, and still publicly deny it and will not be willing to confess, though it's a death sentence. They're going to their death. They're going, death row. They're still lying. They're lying to the grave. They know they're wrong, but they're still willing to pretend that they're not. I mean, you have a lot of people who are willing to do this. This is a common apologetic move. Write that down. True crime. Go watch true crime enough, and you'll find plenty of people who know they're lying and yet still lie. Even when the evidence catches them red-handed, or DNA or whatever it might be that catches them, they still deny it to the end.
That's the clear question. So in early Mormonism, I grant you, there are many, many Mormons who went out, were willing to endure persecution, things like that. But most of those people, if they weren't the original 11 witnesses, would not have been in a place to know whether it's true or false. So it doesn't say much.
Is he willing to question that the first 11 witnesses are full of shit and lying? Or I'm just curious. I mean, I don't know what his stance is on this, but does he think that the first 11 likely were making things up? I don't know. Because if he goes down the natural route of trying to explain it through visionary, like Alex would probably do with Christianity, then it's kind of a catch-22, his term he used earlier. If he's saying that they're willing to make this up, that's even more damning to me, because that's kind of what I think is a possible option. I don't know what option is the case. I have no time machine to go back and interview and research and have my hidden camera set up all over the Roman world when Paul shows up and Peter and them have conversations behind closed doors or whatever. But like, if they're willing to BS, and Mormonism, in his case, let's say they're willing to make up stuff and lie, the first 11, why couldn't the first apostles have lied? Why couldn't they have stolen the body? Oh, because the Gospel of Matthew has 2 guards there in a miraculous event with an angel come down, roll away the tomb, puts the soldiers to sleep, the guards asleep, and then they bribe them with money after they end up finally seeing some vivid post-resurrection appearance of the Lord. Like, come on, man. Why can't that be on the table?
Not the same as the Gospels?
In that regard.
You just said you just said that there were lots of early believers who went out and were willing to be persecuted, but unless they were the original 11 witnesses, they wouldn't have seen it directly. I was actually unclear for a second whether you were talking about Mormonism or Christianity.
No, and I agree with you. So for me, the martyrdom or the risk of martyrdom for the apostles, and I disagree. I would recommend for our listeners, get Sean McDowell's book, The Fate of the Apostles. It's published by Routledge. It is an academic study on the fate of the 12 apostles. And he puts in very high historical confidence, we can know that at least Peter, Paul, and James, the brother of Jesus, were martyred. And we have good evidence for some of the others as well. Mm-hmm. But so I think there is evidence for that. First Clement speaks about it very early. John also looks toward Peter's. But my point is that what I
Alex holding his tongue. No, yeah, there's a lot to be said here. Again, why were they killed? For what reason? And I need to go read Sean McDowell's book myself. By the way, I may just download it and then run it through the Google LM to help me find exactly where he makes his arguments, because this gets brought up a lot. Apologists love to use Sean McDowell's work and to see exactly what the primary source he has for what that martyrdom looks like and why they were killed exactly. What reason were they actually killed for? And were they like given a chance to recant, and then because they won't deny the resurrection, they were killed? Or are there other reasons why they got killed? And of course, Christians saw it as martyrdom. Like the Mormons, if you look at it from an outside point of view, were a pain in the ass to people in Missouri. They were going door to door. They were giving out pamphlets. They were trying to cause other people to become Mormons. They were a problem. They were a problem to people who are already situated and established in Missouri. So from an outside perspective, these people are very problematic. They're becoming a nuisance. And there was such a problem, and I don't know if there were other activities, illegal activities that the Mormons were performing that caused the government to end up intervening and saying eradicate them or push them out of the state, that they ended up going and actually doing that and getting Mormons killed in the process. Mormons have interpreted that experience as martyrdom. But what caused it ultimately? That's a historical question worth researching.
Said was also, we see in Paul's own writings and in Acts, there was a willingness to be martyred. And my point would be that these apostles go out, they don't seem to do it for any kind of earthly reward like we might see with someone like Joseph Smith. They do it for the fervency of communicating this message. The risk of martyrdom is something that is an argument for the sincerity of one's testimony. So
the Mormons were pushing the Mormon message. They were trying to testify and preach it and get other people to become Mormons. And that was a problem. But I would need to go look at the primary sources. I've got a friend of mine who's done the history on this, who can help me get the primary sources, find the historical research and say, hey, check it out. The Mormons, this is what they were doing, and this is why they were getting killed. And by the way, they didn't stop being Mormon under that pressure. They doubled down their faith. They started to internalize and say, we're being attacked for our true beliefs. The same way Christians will say, oh, you cussed at me, you treated me bad, or whatever it might be that people will do. They internalize psychologically and think, I'm being persecuted for my faith, and it validates their faith even more in their minds. It convinces them it's truer because there's persecution. The same thing happened with the Mormons.
Believe that the apostles were sincere, and Paul was sincere, and we don't have a similar in Mormonism, a fervent opponent to Mormonism in the early Mormon church who then converts and comes to believe. So we don't have a Paul figure like that. So I think Christianity is unique there. I would say that they're very sincere, and so we have to grapple with how to explain their sincere testimony.
But we do have.
I don't know if they're sincere. I don't know that. I really, really don't know. I mean, you can be sincere about most things and BS about a lot of stuff too. Joseph Smith did that as well. And anyone who studies Joseph Smith and thinks he was just a complete con artist and they don't realize the nuance and complexity to this man, that he really did believe a lot of superstitious things and actually did believe, but also was a BSer in many ways. Like, this guy was a complex human. It's like saying because I found out you lied several times in your life, you're just a liar. Like, you've never told the truth. You have no sincere beliefs in the world because I know you've lied 3 times. And by the way, you went to court for fraud or something. Therefore, everything about you is now painted in that image. You've literally just flatlined your existence into liar. That's all you are. You don't understand how complex humans really are and how this works. So anyway, I just figured I'd mention that to say I don't know how sincere the earliest experiences, the earliest apostles involved in this really were. And I also wrestle between the literary and the literal. What is real memory? What is real history? Can you really trust those letters of Paul that actually go back to the 50s? There are some scholars who, like Dutch radicals, Nina Livesey, others, who thought they might be later. They don't really go back that early. I don't know what the freaking truth is. And I think all of these options should be on the table. We should be very cautious. We shouldn't be too confident. And this is a reason why Caleb Jackson, one of my buddies who's a Christian apologist, has pointed out, like, you're not going to get skeptics to be convinced by an ancient book or ancient text like this. There's no really strong case to make there. That's why they depend upon modern miracles in order to persuade you. But again, that's not enough for me either. As I've said, I would need a miracle to happen to me or an experience that is so unbelievably profound that I wouldn't give a shit what anyone watching this live stream has to say, what mockery I might receive or whatever. It would be so profound that I would just change overnight. If it was that actually like convincing and real, that I wouldn't care what anyone thought. That's what it would take. But again, I'm not holding my breath, you know?
Accounts of people who fall out with the church and yet hold fast to the vision that they had. I mean, the thing that's important here is, did they see what they claimed to see? There's I mean, so much to say. On the Martyrdom of the Apostles, you know, I agree that that book is well worth reading. First Clement, as you know, Trent, as in Clement's first epistle, which is where this reference comes to Peter, says he says, let's consider the good apostles. He says, there was Peter, who by reason of unrighteous jealousy endured not one but many labors, and thus having X went to his appointed place of glory. Now, some people say been martyred, but as you know, Trent, like, this really just means borne his testimony. That's what the word means. Like, I'm not saying that we know Peter wasn't martyred, but this idea of an early testimony in Clement, all Clement actually says is that he bore his testimony and then went to his appointed place of glory, which could mean that he went around, you know, did his wonderful preaching and then rested on his laurels because he'd done such a great job. We don't know for sure. In fact, you know, Christian tradition has it that Peter was crucified upside down. If you ever look at artwork of Peter's death, it's always him being crucified upside down. And I always love to ask people, what is the actual earliest textual source that we have for the martyrdom of Peter being crucified upside down? I'm not sure if our listeners know. I'm not sure if you two know. It's the apocryphal Acts of Peter. In other contexts, when we talk about apocryphal texts, we're told to be absolutely suspicious of their historicity and myth-making. And yet, when it comes to quite an important part of Christian tradition, I don't know if Trent believes that Peter was crucified upside down or not, but if he does, it is interesting to me that the earliest textual source that we have for that is an apocryphal text. You know, Trent mentioned apocryphal texts earlier. He said, if we look at the Gospel of Peter, we see these sort of mythological embellishments gone crazy. And he said, and I quote, you know, well, I don't quote directly because I only have a few notes here, but you said about how there were lots of Romans. You said like all of the Romans were at the tomb. You then also said, and angels came down. Those are the two sort of examples that you chose. And then I think to myself, well, just look at Matthew's gospel. Matthew, who invents Romans at the tomb to do away with the rumor which was being spread that Jesus' body had been stolen. Matthew, who alone has this angel descend down from the heavens and roll the stone away before the eyes of witnesses, stuff that isn't in the other gospels. In other words, like, I don't know, even if it's not quite as strong, the kind of things you're pointing to as evidences of like myth making in the Gospel of Peter, which you will definitely say is apocryphal, are also present, I think, in Matthew. You also mentioned 1 Corinthians, and I think, I hate to say, Trent, I think you begged the question. You said, well, Paul must believe in a physical resurrection because he compares his experience in 1 Corinthians 15 to those of the apostles, which were physical. One man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens, Trent. Like, I could just say, yes, well, Paul compared his experience to those of the apostles. So they were the same kind. And you say, well, because the disciples must have been physical, so was Paul's. Whereas I say the only eyewitness account that we have of a resurrection appearance is Paul seeing a vision. And so, yes, if he compares his experience to those of the apostles in 1 Corinthians 15, then I'm led to believe that means that the apostles' experiences were visionary. There's also,
so again, just to make the point, and I'm sure we all caught this, Trent starts with the later idea, okay, of bodily, physical, eating fish, breaking bread, physical Jesus, and then works backwards to 1 Corinthians 15 and says, I see continuity, and 1 Corinthians 15 talks about these visionary experiences. I read that as the post-mortem experiences from the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of John. When you read it from 1 Corinthians 15 and understand Paul as a pneumatic body for Jesus, and these are visionary experiences for Jesus's post-mortem state, then you see who else is in the list, and you go, Jesus also, he appeared to me as one untimely born. He appeared also to these guys. The appearance is visionary, which meant you read all of them, you go, it's just a visionary experience for the other apostles that are mentioned here. Whether or not you want to say they're not authentic or they are authentic, either way, it's visionary in nature. And then you go later in the development of the chronology of these gospels, and then you find a flesh and blood or flesh and bone Jesus, which Paul says doesn't inherit the kingdom of heaven. So I think that that's a really interesting observation worthy of pointing out.
There's some evidence here that perhaps, Rudolf Bultmann's idea that the transfiguration of Jesus was originally a post-resurrection appearance. What's one good piece of evidence for this, perhaps? The fact that the first person Paul mentions in his list of people is Peter, the most important of the disciples, who nowhere else is any kind of appearance to Peter mentioned. Except
I think there's an allusion in Luke, isn't there?
An allusion.
The's an allusion to an
Christ,
appearance.
he's risen and has appeared to Peter. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. I mean, like in terms of like a narrative event, in terms of a narrative event of what actually happens to Peter, right? We don't see this anywhere, but we do see this happen at the Transfiguration, where Peter is specifically taken up the mountain to see this event.
So this is important. I didn't catch us the first go around. That what Rudolf Bultmann is, I think, somewhat persuading, or at least for the argument's sake here, Alex, is that when you see the list in 1 Corinthians 15, where it says he appeared to Cephas and he appeared to the 12 and he appeared to James and the apostles and to more than 500 brethren at once, for whom some are still alive. And last of all, one untimely born, he appeared to me. Cephas's appearance, he argues, is the transfiguration episode. So if Bultmann is correct, that the transfiguration episode is not in the correct, it's not in the correct location in the gospel, it should be after the resurrection, that this appearance of Jesus on a mountain, like you see in Galilee in Matthew, is the transfiguration episode. This appearance happens to Jesus. Then 1 Corinthians 15, when you're reading that list, the appearance to Cephas is this transfiguration episode, or at least it could be granted as a potential explanation.
And so I think there's some good evidence to suggest that maybe that might have been the original appearance of Peter, maybe even the one that Luke alludes to. That's kind of a bit besides the point.
Trent, I wonder whether we could probe further your views into the martyrdom. What do you make of the evidence that Alex just presented?
Right. So what I said, and I've been continually saying, is that it is not the martyrdom of the apostles per se that proves Jesus's resurrection or anything like that. Mm-hmm. What we are trying to do is we want to establish the sincerity of testimony. So, for example, there's a lot of strange sightings.
Real quick, Lisa, thanks for the comment. Good comment. I saw a video about the historic Jesus where the historian said it's likely Jesus was buried in a mass grave like other victims. Many scholars actually have thought about this and said it's not likely that a person would go and ask Pontius Pilate for the body and that he would actually let him take down the body. not that it couldn't be, it's not that it's not possible, but it's just unlikely. And I recently had John Dominic Crossan over, and I asked him, do you still stand by your statement that Jesus was likely rotted on a cross? Because the whole point of crucifixion was a sign. It was like saying to others, don't do what this guy is doing. Don't behave this way, or this will be you next. And John Dominic Crossan thinks that the corpse of Jesus was eaten by dogs. And then, of course, the bones are probably cast into a common grave. So, yeah, there are some scholars. I think even Bart Ehrman hints at this. He's changed his views about the empty tomb as a legend, and he thinks that Jesus's body was eaten by dogs. Let me see if I've got a short on YouTube. Myth Vision, Bart Ehrman, Jesus eaten by dogs. Eaten by dogs. By dogs. There's a short. Let me see if I can get this here. Shorts. Trying to find it. I got a lot of Bart Ehrman shorts too on here. See, Jesus' body. Worth showing you real quick. I think it's worth. Is the empty tomb of Jesus? Was Jesus? Is this one? No, that's Bart Ehrman's. Okay. There's a lot of different shorts. I'm competing on here. Trying to find the one where he says, he literally says what you're talking about, but he goes further. Here it is. Found it. All right. Let me pause. Sharing this with you. Appreciate the comment. By the way, everybody, this is round 2 to my reaction to Alex O'Connor. Like the video, share it out there, drop comments, all that kind of stuff. Feel free to send in some super chats if you can. It helps us out, keeps Myth Vision going. We greatly appreciate that, and hopefully you can all hear this. Here we go. Can you hear that, or is it all silent? Nope, no sound. Okay. Let me play. Jeez, let me do this then. Okay. Here we go. Sharing it now.
Jesus' tomb was not discovered empty on the third day. I think it's legendary. I read every reference I could find in every Roman author or Greek author about what Romans did with crucifixion.
This was a fun
And one of the kind of consistent motifs, nobody describes the process of crucifixion. They don't describe actually how they do it, but they do sometimes talk about what happens after the person dies. And what they say in every case is that the person was left on the cross to begin to deteriorate on the cross, to rot on the cross, and to be eaten by scavengers. And so this was part of the punishment. The Romans wanted to show that you not just they would torture you to death, they'd leave your corpse to be desecrated. And people hated that in the ancient world. People today wouldn't like it much, but in the ancient world, this was horrifying, that your corpse would not be given a proper burial. But that's part of the punishment. You don't get a proper burial.
So the point of crucifixion is not to take it down the night of. The point that the scholars who make this observation is crucifixion was made for torturing, in a sense of not just the individual to give them excruciating pain, that would play a part, but it's more about the agonizing death that others observe as a warning. Don't be like this guy. You know, you get this sign above Jesus like, hey, dude, King of the Jews, don't be like this guy. This guy's getting killed for claiming to be the Messiah or the king. Yeah, so appreciate the comment. Let's continue where we left off there. Hopefully I can get this audio easily back up, and we should be good to go.
read other books trying to downplay the resurrection, and they'll make comparisons to Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster or aliens or things like that. And I think in many of those cases, though, there's good evidence that the testimony may not be sincere because it's often positively received. You get to be in the news, people get to celebrate you. It's, you know, it's all well and good in that respect. But what I'm showing is that the early proclaimers of Jesus's resurrection, who would have known whether it really happened or not if they just simply made the whole thing up. So Paul and Peter and the original apostles, that they're willing to endure threats to their lives. And that's very clear in Paul's letters, that he's stoned, thrown out of synagogues, worried about what the Romans may do to them.
I think, I have to say this. The reason this is about Mormonism, and I get it, and a lot of people probably like, I don't like this. Why is this constantly about Mormonism? It's because literally everything he's saying just about applies to Mormonism. But he doesn't believe Mormonism. Like, he just described all these issues. That's what happened to Mormons. Mormonism, same problem, same expansion growth. He pointed out in the last episode, I think Rodney Stark compares earliest Christianity's growth and development at the same trajectory as the growth and development of Mormonism. Like, it's not a miraculous growth. It's not like it really expanded and grew that much. It didn't. It's similar to what we find in Mormonism.
So I think that's very clear. Now I think when one leads that all the way to martyrdom, it's even more evidence of sincerity. When it comes to Peter's martyrdom, I think many people interpret Clement of Rome as speaking of that. Ignatius of Antioch also talks about it in an indirect way in AD 107.
The Gospel of John as well.
Yes, and that's another important one about the death you will endure. And John, of course, would have been written, 30 years after Peter died.
And then John 21, the chapter in which that appears, was written some years after that.
Right. So we're not going down.
I like that he's getting more comfortable in textual criticism, because I tried to explain this a long time ago to all the skeptics, the agnostics, the atheists, those who don't believe in Christianity. They all have stuck with the old, kind of the call-in show, atheist type of, I guess you'd say, the way it used to be with a lot of the atheists, like Matt Dillahunty's arguments and others that were there. And Myth Vision came in and was like, I'm going to talk to the leading experts in the world that are textual critics, that are comparative mythologists, that have debunked and dissected this stuff, that understand this material inside and out and have really analyzed it in depth. You have nothing to be afraid of in analyzing it, in case someone thought, no, I don't like it. I don't want to look at it. No, there's nothing to be afraid of. And the more you really understand this material, the more you recognize that this apologetic fundamentalist stuff is for the birds. Actually, it's for the dogs. Let's put it that way. It is something that strengthens the confidence you have in realizing how human all of this really is.
I got my own path of heading down here, right? You're fine. Now, the Acts of Peter. Now, my point about apocryphal gospels, I do not believe that everything in an apocryphal gospel needs to be taken is just false. I think that's bad historiography to say, okay, everything that is in a gospel is historical bedrock, and everything that is not in a gospel is just totally false. We have to sift through the different evidences here. My point with the Gospel of Peter was that there appears to be an apologetic motif contradicting what we know and putting the large, like the crowds and the Jewish priests and all of the Romans, everyone there present at the tomb. More the angelic element. It's not even just the presence of angels. They emerge from the tomb, and they're very, very large. And Jesus himself emerges from the tomb, and he's very, very big. He's like a giant.
And he's got a walking, talking cross behind him as well, which is quite surprising.
Actually, we're not entirely sure. Mark Goodacre has made some arguments that the Latin or the original language may refer to not the cross, but the crucified one.
Okay.
So that's a little sticky.
Yes, and I'm actually glad he brought this up. This was something that I've read from Ian Mills. So yes, he's correct. Trent Horn is right that this is not necessarily a cross. It's been understood that way for a long time, but there are some scholars who push back on that.
There we have to. So I mean, as I said once before, I want to be I'm always trying to dig down deep to make sure I got all my ducks in a row here. But I think that that's very different from when I look at the angels that go, but it's not even angels. And Mark is just, it's just a young man who's described who is assumed to be an angel. So it's a very sober account. But even if there are angels that are present, they're here. They inform the women about this. But even the guards themselves, some might say, well, that was an apologetic motif that was invented that still shows an explanation that the tomb was empty.
Yeah.
I'm not prepared to throw that out. If you made up the guard story, you would have put the guards there on Friday, not Saturday, because the body still could have been stolen. And there were. It could have been related to an event that happened about 16 years before the resurrection. There was a slave named Clemens who he was a slave to Agrippa Postumus. He was the grandson of Caesar Augustus. And he stole the bones of his murdered master to claim that his master survived. And he impersonated him to say, yeah, I'm him, to try to because he bore a likeness to him, to try to, continue on his legacy, to impersonate him. And because that's one of the big reasons, why would there be guards? How did Herod know more? How did Pilate know more than the apostles did? I think there could have been a concern about that during Passover, and Pilate doesn't want any riots during Passover. He's dealt with that before. Enough of this nonsense.
That's a lot of what if. That is a lot of what if. 16 years ago, there was a guy who impersonated his master that he stole the bones from, to hide the bones from, so they didn't know. In a historical sense, is it that it's common that a body goes missing? That's more likely resurrection and reception, baby. Let me show you my buddy's book here. It's in the other room. Resurrection and reception in early Christianity. Bodies go missing because that's part of a translation trope as well. Bodies get stolen. This is stuff Dale Allison Jr. talks about all the time. And there were condemnings. There were laws that said do not, grave robbing was a problem, but it was also people stole bodies of people who were important figures. They used their bodies in magical incantation. So I think the whole thing just seems a bit problematic, but I just think it's a lot of what ifs. But
so I'm not prepared to throw out the guard story in that way. I don't think it shows a myth making in that regard, but I do think that
he doesn't think it shows myth making in that regard. I think it does.
If you're making up something, the apologetic motif is put everybody there, so you've got really good evidence. But in Mark and the other gospels agree with this, the first witnesses are women, and women's testimony in the ancient world is
the same shit. It does repeat itself. I mean, it's the same apologetics over and over and over and over and over.
Incredibly low value. It's basically below a criminal's, which I think speaks to the fact that it's historical. Even more so the idea that you have Mark and Luke describing this. If you were going to make up the whole gospel accounts, pick Peter, Paul, Philip, pick somebody more notable. I see a lot of signs that point towards a sober historical account of just describing things as they happen.
So there's a lot here. If you watched my last video, I'm not going to rehash it all here. I did a video. I believe it was my last one against what's his name? The guy with the really strange hairline on Sean O'Ryan. Sean, what's his name? Sean, the big millions of subscribers Sean show. He's like another spinoff of Joe Rogan. Sean Ryan? Is that right? Sean Ryan? Anyway, Sean Ryan, I did a little debunk of this guy who has been going around doing a bunch of apologetics. He brings up these same things, the women's testimony. And one of the things when you read Mark, just read it as a story, okay? Don't read this as don't get lost in not realizing what you're reading. He constantly reverses expectations. Lord, can I sit at your right and your left? Someone is, trying to have their son sit at the right and left. And I'm not sure if they directly ask. So in Matthew, it's his mother who asks to make it less rude. But yeah, they're not willing to, enter his kingdom and be seated at his right and left. There's two thieves, two lestes, if you will, that are at his right and his left on the cross, entering glory. So there's reversed expectations in Mark over and over and over. And one of those is that women see the appearance of, they are willing to go to the tomb, but the disciples flee. They're scattered. They're terrified. They're not willing to go to the tomb. It has nothing to do with embarrassing evidence to show historical criteria here. By the way, women's testimony did count, even if it was less than men. But like, they make it about that to make this bona fide historical case, and not realizing just the literary works. That's the literary work of Mark and what he's trying to do. But also, when you go later in the Gospels, you do find men are the first ones who show up. And I believe that's in Luke. Let me double check here. First to the tomb. In Mark. But the Gospels, in their growing and tellings, have men show up first at the tomb. Let's see what happens here. 1 second while my computer thinks. Okay, so Mark 16, 1-8, we know the story. Women arrive first. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome come to the tomb at dawn. They find the stone rolled away, a young man in white inside. They flee in terror, say nothing to no one. Gospel ends here. In the earliest manuscripts, no men arrive at all. No appearances of any kind. The men do not enter the narrative again. Matthew, women appear first. Mary Magdalene and other Mary come at dawn. An angel descends, rolled back the stone, announces the resurrection. The women leave to tell the disciples on the way. Jesus himself appears to them. They grasp his feet and worship. Only after this do the 11 disciples go to Galilee, where they meet Jesus on a mountain. The men do not visit the tomb at all in Matthew. Luke, women arrive first. Multiple women, including Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James. They find the stone rolled away and the empty tomb. 2 men in dazzling clothes appear and announce the resurrection. The women run to tell the 11, who do not believe them. Then comes verse 12, which says, Peter ran to the tomb, looked in, and saw the linen cloths by themselves, and went home wondering. Important note here, Luke 24:12 is textually disputed. It is missing from some important early manuscripts, including Codex Bezae. Many critical scholars, including Bart Ehrman, have argued it is a later scribal addition, harmonizing Luke with John. The earliest text of Luke may not have had Peter visiting the tomb at all. That seems like an interesting addition. And then John has Mary Magdalene arrive first, alone in the version. She finds the stone rolled away, runs immediately to Peter and the beloved disciple, and says, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb. We do not know where. And we know Peter and the beloved, they race to see who can beat each other to the tomb. Of course, the beloved beats Peter. And anyway, so there's a development there that men, this is the more important argument. So it says, let's see what this pattern is saying. So the women always arrive at the tomb first. This is consistent across all 4 Gospels. The apologetic claim that the women witnesses element is preserved against legendary development is correct on this narrow point. Even John, the latest Gospel, has Mary Magdalene as the first person at the tomb. By the way, women were the first people to go to the tombs in burial practices in the ancient world as well. I mentioned a female scholar, I can't remember her name in the video. Sources are there. But then it goes on to say, in Mark, men never enter the tomb narrative. In Matthew, men never enter the tomb but meet Jesus elsewhere. In Luke, Peter makes a brief tomb visit in a textually disputed verse. In John, the male disciples become major narrative players at the tomb, with Peter and the beloved disciple competing for who arrives first and who believes first. There's a growing development you can see. The men get more important as the narrative develops. This is a real pattern. Women's roles stay roughly constant. They discover the empty tomb. The men's role expands dramatically. They go from absent Mark. Anyway, we've read that. There's a lot to look in here. There's the reversed expectation that I think is important noting. Women would have been the ones expected to go to the tomb because of burial practices. And that would be, even if I was writing a fiction, you would have women go to the tomb because that's what they would do in antiquity. In burial ritual, burial practices, that's what they would do. Scholars have pointed this out as well. But I just think they're wanting you to just buy this women. They would never have made up women at the tomb. And if women were the ones constantly dealing with burial practices and the burial rituals with the dead, why wouldn't you, if you're writing a story about that, just have verisimilitude with that? Meaning it could have been that women really went to the tomb in real history, or in fiction, because it's what you do. And I think of other gods and other figures, like when Osiris is killed and cut into 14 pieces, it's his wife, a woman, Isis, who's looking for the body parts. If you look at Adonis, or if you look at Tammuz, women are mourning in the Jerusalem temple in the Old Testament for Tammuz, the dead, deceased god that is a dying and rising deity. They're the ones that are mourning it. I'm just saying you can look at this through mythical, fiction, reversed expectation. Women would have gone to the tomb in real life. So whether in fiction or in real history, you would have seen this. It just becomes a selling point when apologists are trying to nail you on it. That's what it feels like.
Alex, I saw you perk up when Trent mentioned the women witnesses argument. Did you have anything to say to that?
Hold on. I definitely want to hear what Alex has to say, but Aaron says the apostles not going to the tomb is strange to me. Again, and you'd think they would all want to look. Yeah, you would think, of course, but that's us, I think, reading the story with already knowing the conclusion. We're dealing with the narrative. So for me, I think it isn't strange, because constantly throughout the narrative, when you read Mark, the earliest gospel, which is the foundation to the rest of the gospels, they just change things as they rewrite it. Mark, every time you turn around, the apostles are saying they're going to do something. Peter says, I will go to death for you, Lord. I will die for you. You're going to deny me 3 times, or you're going to deny me before the cock crows thrice, Peter. You're not really going to do the thing you said you're going to do. Hey, Lord, when we enter your kingdom, can we sit at your right and your left hand? They're not even willing to go to the crucifixion with him, right? They flee. They're terrified. They say one thing, but a whole other expectation occurs. So once you see a pattern in Mark for why they don't go to the tomb, why he doesn't appear to them in this gospel, you could see what Mark's up to. The Gospel of Matthew tries to fix a lot of these things. He doesn't want the disciples to look as negative as they do. He changes Mark. And lots of scholars have highlighted this. When you put the gospel side by side, you can see those things. Thanks for the comment, Aaron. Appreciate that.
So much. I'm actually surprised to hear this come up. I know that this is a common sort of apologetical motif, but to me, it's clear as day. Women discover the empty tomb, which means that it must be true, because women's testimony wasn't worth that much, and so why would this be invented? There are a few things to say here. Firstly, who knew where the tomb was? The women were told that the disciples had fled at the crucifixion of Jesus.
Could they have brought men along with them?
Well, we'll get to that. I mean, maybe they could have done, but we know that they weren't. We know that they weren't at the crucifixion, and we know that they'd fled. And so, in keeping with the theme of the disciples fleeing, afraid, and their cowardice, they wouldn't even know where Jesus was buried. Of course, it's going to be the women who like, it's like a narrative. Yeah. If the story said that Peter went to the tomb, the question would be, well, how did he find out? Well, Peter does eventually go to the tomb. Why is that? Because yes, women discover the empty tomb. They have no idea what's happened. And what's the first thing that they go and do? They go and get the men to come and verify it for us. Right? They run to the men and they say, oh, we don't know what's happened. They're these, as the early Christian critic Celsus says, they're these hysterical women, and they don't know what they've seen, and they run to the disciples, and it's the disciples who come and verify it for them. So, I mean, it's an instant verification. Right, like in other words, if this were some apologetical motif, it might be that's why they have them go and check.
But does that apply better to Matthew, Luke, and John than to that original kernel of the account in Mark?
Oh, certainly, yeah. It certainly does. I mean, going and finding the men, of course, it does. Yeah. But like another thing to point out is that
when we read about Matthew having them immediately tell the men, and then Peter goes and gives a quick look. I believe it's in Matthew. Did Matthew give that? Let me double check that. Matthew has women arrive first. Mary Magdalene, the other Mary at dawn. Angel descends, rolls back the stone, announces the resurrection. The women leave to tell the disciples. On the way, Jesus himself appears to them. So he appears to them somewhere else. Luke is where you see Peter goes and gives a brief look in the tomb. And then John, of course, has Peter Cephas, Peter, and the beloved disciple, which never gets named.
A bit of a silly thing to say, but people often just sort of assume that ancient writers are stupider than we are. Like, we sometimes think, and by the way, I'm not saying that this is made up, but I'm saying if you want to argue that it's not, and you say, well, they wouldn't do this, like, because isn't it so realistic that they'd have this feature? Doesn't it make it all that more believable? Do you think ancient authors would have been clever enough to think of that themselves as well? You know, like it just seems to me, in other words, that like
that is what they call verisimilitude. When ancient fictional authors write, they use real people, real places, real geography, you know, people, places, and things that are real. And then often they write in fictional stuff as well. Verisimilitude. If you're going to write a story, it would be bonkers to have the tomb discovered by something that is unrealistic if you're wanting to, you know, sell a story that has a historical setting. Now, you can write stories. Lucian does this, where he writes about stuff that goes on like almost like an outer space experience kind of thing. When you do that, you can write fiction that isn't based in reality on Earth, but most of the ancient fictions were on Earth with people, places, and things that had verisimilitude. Solera Knight, thanks for the super chat. My first super chat of the day. Thank you. Appreciate that, man. Solera Knight says, where does the Bible say this is a true story? Well, if you want to take it as like they're trying to sell you, I would go to 2 Peter. Like that place in 2 Peter chapter 1, we did not believe in cleverly devised myths, as, you know, some would suppose. We were eyewitnesses of his, you know, majesty on the mountain. Some seem to suggest these are myths, and they'd be right. But either way, the author is trying to sell you that this seems to be true. At least the idea of the appearances, the resurrection, or something. That is where I would go if I was trying to stillman this question. But clearly, Mark is wanting to just tell you that Jesus is the Son of God. The whole point is this is the Genesis for Jesus, the Son of God, a demigod, if you will. I think that's what's going on. Richard Miller has done a lot on this. So, but yeah, the Bible never says this is a true story, but it doesn't give you the cautious, skeptical approach that I think a decent, good historian would. So when you read Herodotus, and he's talking about Zalmoxis, by the way, in book 4, paragraph 95. Bear with me. Let me grab Herodotus real quick. Actually, let me pull it up. Do I have it up here? Let me just pull it up on here. Herodotus, Zalmoxis. Herodotus, source, Zalmoxis. Let's see exactly where this is at. Herodotus. There we go. That's what I need. Book 4, chapters 94 to 96. Okay. When you're and this is just one historian. There's obviously tons of historians you can go to. Herodotus, book 4. There we go. Sharing my screen. When you're reading something and it's not telling you, well, this is what they say, or this is what someone else believed, and no, he's just literally hook, line, and sinker, buy what I'm selling you. So he goes on the Gittite, right? But before he came to the Ister, he first subdued the Gittite, who pretend to be immortal. The Thracians of Salmodisus and of the country above the towns of Apollonia and Mesmabria, who are called Sirminai and Nipsai, surrendered themselves unresisting to Darius. So this is the Persian Greek kind of issue. But the Gittite, who are the bravest and most law-abiding of all Thracians, resisted with obstinacy and were enslaved forthwith. As to their claim to be immortal, this is how they show it. Now, he's talking about their claim and how they show it. They believe they do not die, but that he who perishes goes to the god Zalmoxis or Gebelezus, as some of them call him. Once in every 5 years, they choose by lot one of their people and send him as a messenger to Zalmoxis, charged to tell of their needs, and this is their manner of sending. 3 lances are held by men thereto, appointed. Others seize the messenger to Zalmoxis by his hands and feet and swing him and hurl him aloft onto the spear points. What they're doing is they're taking one of their guys, they're trying to throw him onto the spears to kill him. It's some primitive crap. But remember now, this is all about the claim to be immortal. So these particular people who worship Zalmoxis are being sent as messengers to Zalmoxis by his hands and feet, and they want him to be killed, right? If he be killed by the cast that they throw him up there, they believe that the god regards them with favor. But if he is not killed, right, they blame the messenger himself, deeming him a bad man, and send another messenger in place of him, whom they blame. It is while the man yet lives, they charge him with the message. They tell him what to bring with them to the afterlife. Moreover, when there is with thunder and lightning, these same Thracians shoot arrows skyward as a threat to the god, believing in no other god but their own. For myself, I have been told by the Greeks who dwell beside the Hellespont and Pontus that this Zalmoxis was a man who was once a slave in Samos. Like, he's telling you he's being told. He's not like, this is the case. There's a cautious historical angle that the historian's giving you, right? His master being Pythagoras, son of Menarchus. I'm not sure if you're pronouncing that properly. Presently, after being freed and gaining... Okay, we're going to go. He literally tells them they can live forever. He creates an underground chamber, according to this. So while he was doing this, I have said, teaching this doctrine, he was all the while making him an underground chamber. When this was finished, he vanished from sight of the Thracians and descended into the underground chamber where he lived for 3 years. The Thracians wishing him back and mourning him for dead. Then in the 4th year, he appeared to the Thracians, and thus they came to believe what Zalmoxis had told them. Such is the Greek story about him. For myself, I neither disbelieve nor fully believe the tale about Zalmoxis and his underground chamber, but I think that he lived many years before Pythagoras. He's cautious. He's not saying this is the case. When you read the Gospels, what do you get? This is the Son of God. He's the truth. And then you're sucked into the story. This is not a historical text writing you about what really happened. This is a theologically heavily persuasive narrative that wants you sucked in. They don't want you to doubt. In fact, they do all the doubting for you. They have the people, the protagonist in the story, doubt so you don't have to. Thomas doubts, and it's like Jesus breaks the fourth wall and says to you, blessed are those who don't see yet still believe, Mr. or Mrs. Reader. That's what they're doing. They're not giving you, well, some say that this happened and others said this. I'm not sure what is the case. That would be a careful historian. The Gospels aren't doing that at all. They do not. All right. Let's go back to Alex and continue the debate review.
The reasons that we have for thinking that it might be historical are things which could have occurred to somebody who was trying to come up with it. But I think it's clear as day that it would be the women who would discover the empty tomb, because they're the ones who knew where it was. They were the ones who were following Jesus throughout his passion. They were the ones who saw where he was buried. And then, as I say, the first thing they go and do is grab some men to go and verify it for them. So I don't know if this is as sort of feminist a story.
And I suppose the sort of social function of women in the ancient world in association with mourning. I wondered what you...
I was also going to say, like, you know, who's anointing the bodies? Although, of course, in John's gospel, it's Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea who sort of bring these oils and vestments to the body. But by the way, what's the first thing that Mary Magdalene thinks when she sees the empty tomb? She doesn't think, oh gosh, remember when Jesus predicted that he was going to rise from the dead? That must be what's happened. They say, she says, they've taken the Lord and we do not know where they've put him. Yeah. Her first assumption is that the body has been taken. And not only that, but she says this in John's gospel after running back to the disciples, when in Luke's gospel, we're told that on the way back from the tomb, Jesus appears to her himself. If Jesus has just appeared to her and told her to go and tell the disciples, it'd be really weird for her to go to the disciples and say, they've taken the Lord and we do not know where they've put him. That point at which in Luke's gospel, Jesus says, touch my feet, you know, like has all these sort of extra physicality bits. Look, I think it's also... important. Actually, no. Do you know what? I've been throwing out too much. Let's give. Yeah,
I'd like to hear what you have to respond to that argument about the women, Trent.
Right. So I would be cautious in where Alex is going here when we're trying to sift through ancient documents and records. What is historical? What is literary? What is trying to pull one over on us? What is an apologetic motif? I would be worried about the clever forger thesis. This idea that people will say, and I've seen this before in debates about whether Jesus existed, where you have on the far, far extreme the people who say, no, Jesus never existed. And anytime evidence is presented saying, well, this is really good evidence that there was a man named Jesus, we have Josephus Tacitus, and it sounds just like them, the recalcitrant, the intransigent mythicist will say, but a very clever Christian forger would make it sound just like Tacitus or just like Josephus. And of course we'd expect it to sound just like them. But I'm like, oh, wait a minute. So if it doesn't sound like them, it's a forgery. But also if it sounds like them, it's just a really, really smart forger.
To be clear,
becomes
I don't believe this. I just want to point out to people that when thinking about
Sure.
forgery, people weren't
Yes.
stupid. But of course, I don't think the story was forged. I just want to say that, like, the 2 points that were important there, I think, Trent, were that the women were the ones who were following Jesus during the Passion, and the women immediately go and get men to verify the facts for them.
Right. So first, then, so we have to go back, and the comparison I was making was between an example in the Gospel of Peter of something that appears. Here's a mindset of somebody who is trying to add details just to support the account, versus someone who appears to just be recording the account itself.
We fundamentally disagree on they're just recording the account itself. I think he's talking about Mark. Matthew's copying Mark, which is Matthew supposedly a disciple. Why? Oh, because he's getting the sermons of Peter through Mark. An eyewitness needs the sermons of Peter to write his own story when he was there. There's a lot of problems. Even the Catholic UCCSB website, I think it's called, recognizes this problem, that it's not an eyewitness account. But just to go a little further here, this isn't like a forger necessarily. This is a crafted story. And if Dennis MacDonald and other Q scholars are right that think maybe Mark also knew about Q, is this episode in Q? Just imagine that the material you find from Matthew and Luke, right, that overlaps that you don't find in Mark. A lot of scholars think philologically that there was a source of some sort prior to Mark. Mark was not the first gospel. What did that look like? What do actually the best reconstructions of that seem to suggest? And when you look at that and you could see, hey, maybe this author's constructing a narrative. It's not just sayings, but there's a narrative here. Why can't an author just go based off of what seemed to be historically real to them at the time? If Luke Acts is doing that, and he grants that he is, and I could show you plenty of places where Luke Acts seems to be off historically, he makes boo-boos or he makes historical exaggerations, taxing the whole world, or there was a plague or a famine that the whole world had a famine. No, the whole world didn't have a famine. There's a lot of things that he does there. There's other problems with the Theudas Judas stuff that we can get into. But, like, I don't get it. You don't have to come up with some strange forger explanation for a narrative here.
Comes to the women, though, like, well, of course women would be there because they knew the location of the tomb. Well, I would say that Joseph of Arimathea knew the location and is described as a secret disciple of Jesus. And I agree with Dale Allison. I think there's good evidence that this was not made up, that someone to fictionalize an account of their beloved rabbi would pay him tribute by having him being buried, have an honorable burial by friends and others. And it was not unheard of, by the way, for crucifixion victims to have burials. We have a first century skeleton of a man named Yehohanan from a village called Givat Hav Miftar, and he was a crucifixion victim, and he was found in a tomb. Now, so the women itself, you might say, well, look, even if they do see it, it's confirmed by the men in the account, so it's not that big a deal. But then I would ask the question, it's like, okay, if he was making it.
By the way, real quick on that comment there, yes, that's why some say that it's possible, because we have evidence that it's happened before. But does that make it more likely or less likely? How common did crucified people get buried? And we're talking about buried, like taken down from the cross, buried. Because, I mean, you could find an example of a crucified victim who was buried, but when did they get buried? Like, we know that we found the nail in an ankle bone. I believe they found this in a sarcophagus, but was this already a rotten corpse and they found the bones of the victim and then put it into a sarcophagus later? Or did they take him down? I need to look at the source. Did they actually take him down from the cross in order to bury him? Interesting. I don't know about the source off the top of my head, but I'm just throwing it out there.
Up, then they would have that and their testimony is fine. But we also have to be careful to say, if it did happen, what would we expect? If the women going to the tomb, not sure what they're going to do just because they want to wail and mourn, and they encounter that it's open and they see Jesus, what would we expect to happen? Well, we'd expect them to go and tell others. And if you heard about this, we wouldn't expect the other male disciples to just do nothing. I'd go check. You would. So I think it fits. We always have to ask that question. What would we expect if X happened? Does it conform to that? And it still goes back to just following the evidence where it goes. But I think, and I want to put this here because we're going to run out of time real soon. It's how it goes in this exchange, and I love it because we're having a lot of fun. I would just encourage everyone listening, look, we've got something very extraordinary here. We have I think Alex and I both agree, it's very, very clear Jesus did die. He existed, he died.
Yep.
And that, well, I guess this is how it works, Alex. You can see if I'm right about this. It's like we close in on the resurrection event from two directions, very strong evidence, and it moves towards this thing in the middle we're trying to figure out. So it's like Jesus died, undeniable. There's within a few years, we had people proclaiming he had risen bodily from the dead. So now it's like we're trying to get back to that Easter Sunday morning and trying to figure out I think everyone can agree something happened. And I think it's up to everyone should really look into this the data, to put forward what explains that happened. And I think...
Yeah, I mean, something happened, all right. But when he says something, I think he means something other than the something that I might even posit. I mean, this is why I think it's important to study other cults. Because, like, does he know that under Claudius in the 50s, you literally had Claudius implementing, that means prior to Claudius, there was already a story about Attis's death and resurrection. That for 3 days, he dies, they mourn him, they self-flagellate, they're cutting themselves, they're wailing for the death of Attis, and then the third day he's alive again. This happened, by the way, on Easter. Every year, the spring equinox. This would happen with Attis, the Hilaria festival. And when you ask yourself, like, something happened, yeah, well, something sure did. What is that something? I don't think he at least has that possibility in his mind for developing legend or mythology around this time of the year for the resurrection. Did he die? I say, yeah, I think he probably died. I wouldn't be overly certain in the same manner that he is about a lot of this stuff, because gods in myth and legends also die and rise from the dead and things like that as well. So I grant that there was a historical dude who died, but what do we make of that? Paul's already talking legend in his own letters, if they are as early as the consensus seems to suggest.
Resurrection, it does explain all the data without having to compress or force it, really, whereas other explanations tend to have to bring in more ad hoc elements.
I don't know if ad hoc is the answer. I would just say more evidence, period. If you bring in more evidence to the table, you actually get a clearer picture. You get to see more about how the function of other cults operates, reasons behind why you can answer and explain what's going on in this material. And it's not just limited to these books. Like, if all you're using is the 27 New Testament books to try and answer this question, you're limiting, I think, yourself from being able to see other possible explanations that make a lot of sense of the data. So you could say there are ad hoc explanations, and there are, but why is it that the resurrection makes the best sense, is the most likely in his book? Well, I think it's because he already believes, and he's defending that position. He's defending the conclusion there, and then he's working backwards to see the data work that way.
Alex, I'm really interested to kind of take stock. And I mean, presumably there are a number of facts here that scholars and historians discuss.
Yep.
You know, one of them would be the crucifixion. I think you'd be on board with that.
Yep.
We have the empty tomb.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like you might be agnostic about the empty tomb.
Mm-hmm.
And then the appearances, you think that there were appearances of Jesus in the sense of people had visions, hallucinations?
I don't know. I'm hypothesizing.
Where do you
that
stand on this?
I'm saying there are sort of levels of skepticism. Like if there are like doors that need to sort of be broken open, right? And as you said, it sort of goes in that order. It's like, was there a man called Jesus? Yes. Okay. What's next? He was crucified. Okay. Yes. What's next? He was laid in the tomb. Okay. Maybe. What's next? And then we sort of keep going. Trent said earlier at the very beginning of this debate, he said, you know, the evidence that Jesus was alive after his death is as good as the evidence that he was alive before his death. I don't know if that's what you believe, or if it just sort of came out that way.
Well, I think I meant to say that there are similar kinds of ways to verify that. Just you could show someone's alive by people saying we saw him.
Sure, but I just don't think it's true, because of course one of the reasons why we're so certain of Jesus' existence is a relatively speaking for the ancient world, a wealth of extra biblical sources by supporters, by opponents, just referencing the existence of this person. Of course, we don't have any like references to appearances to Jesus after his death outside of what could be apologetical material, but certainly is material of his supporters, including some events which you might suspect have some attention drawn to them elsewhere, such as the appearance of the 500 in Paul.
Well, it would be very hard to find non-Christian testimony of a Christian fact like the resurrection, because
that'd be like finding non-Mormons agree with the golden plate statement. Unlikely. By the way, Solera Knight, thank you so much for that super chat. Premature burial, is it taphophobia was widespread. I've never really thought about this. I've always heard about the swoon theory, but let me just see. I don't know. I got to look up that word. Taphophobia. So is a specific intense fear being buried alive by mistake, rooted in the Greek words taphos, grave, and phobos, fear. This phobia often combines severe claustrophobia with the dread of death, often stemming from anxiety over being incorrectly pronounced dead. I mean, this sounds more like it's in line with the swoon theory. Like if you're using this for Jesus, that he gets buried in the tomb, but he's not really dead. And he appears later, but he's actually still alive. And they're like, oh, he's alive again. And it's like, I've been alive the whole time. I'm not convinced of this idea, but it's more likely to me that this would be on the table than the actual resurrection being literally true. We have people who were acting like Nero all the time. There were several imposters who pretended to be Nero. They thought he revived. Nero redivivus. This was a well-known thing. Let me see something. James says, yes, Jesus is not the first so-called God to be resurrected. There are many others, like Osiris as a point. 100%, James. There are several others. Baal, Osiris, Adonis, of course, Tammuz. You can go back to the goddess Ishtar or Inanna. You can look to Attis, Dionysus, which is also well documented. Look to Heracles. There's a 5th century BCE source where he dies by Typhon, and he ends up being resurrected by a quail bird. And I'm talking about bodily resurrected, not apotheosized and summoned to heaven through the fire, and then his bones aren't left in the pyre, ashes, which we've seen. I'm talking about he gets killed by Typhon in a field, and he's resurrected by a quail bird, and he's alive again, revived type resurrection. There's so much to look into here, but I agree with you. That's why I don't know why it's not on the table. Why the dying and rising stuff doesn't penetrate this the field of study, at least in understanding a resurrection theology to some degree. Even if you wanted to couch it within Jewish ideas, there's a lot within the Jewish material literarily for why they would have the idea of a resurrection. Individuals with Elijah and Elisha are resurrected in the Old Testament, individuals in the Gospels. It's a little baffling to me. Angry Amalekite Infant, thank you so much for the super chat. Hypothetical. If the Council of Carthage had canonized the Gospel of Peter in 397 CE, what would Trent now say about walking, talking crosses? Yeah, like this is a great mental exercise. I think I'd love to ask Trent that and see what he had to say. He'd go, well, that's not what happened. And, of course, could he play with the hypothetical? Like if I pressed him and said, no, dude, you have to answer this question. Like, if it was canon, if the church said this is legit, would you then let that not be so fantastic and buy it? Now, he might still go, well, I think Goodacre has a better interpretation of it, that it's really talking about the resurrected Jesus. That's a giant. Okay. even then, would you then believe the text? Would you, like, again, why does it work that way? These texts are canon. These are sacred. I think you're onto something there, Angry Amalekite. I think you're onto something. Thank you for the super chat. I appreciate it as well, by the way. Really keeps the lights on here. We greatly appreciate that support. But yeah, you could apply this in so many different aspects and in different books as well. All right, getting back to the exchange here.
If one were convicted of that fact.
I'm not just looking for that. I'm looking for so for example, in Jesus's sort of lifetime, we have sort of people who believe you could have an extra biblical source that people believe 500 people had seen Jesus. You could have an extra biblical source that says 500 people claim to see Jesus. In fact, even if we had, if we discovered a historical source that just corroborated the 500, wasn't an eyewitness testimony, but just said, and 500 people, and here were some of their names, and here's where it occurred, claimed to see Jesus, I would see that as incredible evidence for the resurrection. Not because it needs to be something that an opponent couldn't have written, but just because it would be something that's like corroborating. It shows that there is an event which was known to other people.
I don't know, Alex. I think because you might just say, well, Tacitus or someone else just got this from someone who read Paul, and so there might be questions about whether it's independently attested. But the 500, by the way, the 500. I would say, this is a mysterious thing. I think what makes a lot of sense of it is in Matthew 28, that's where we talk about those who doubted in the appearance on the mountain or the hilltop in Galilee. I think it very well could be because there is the description of talking about my go and appear to my brothers and other, those, described in Mark and in Matthew. And we have the fulfillment there. And that would make sense if there were, especially if you had the Sermon on the Mount, right? You're on a mount. That's how hundreds of people can hear you in the ancient world when you're talking to them. I've been to that area in Galilee myself.
Me too.
That would make sense. That, okay, so we have a large enough area for someone to see someone like that. And that would explain if you have 500 people, those who didn't know Jesus as well, those could be the doubters versus those who knew him very well.
The only point that I'm making is that I don't know if I would say that about that evidence. I have no idea. But what I'm saying is that when you say that we have just as good reasons to think that he was alive before the crucifixion as after, I just don't think that's true. We might have just as good sort of testimony from like the Gospels maybe, but the thing that makes the historical Jesus case so strong and undeniable is the extra biblical material. You don't have any of that for the post-resurrection appearances. Maybe
no, because I would still find the evidence from the Gospels and Paul's letters to Jesus existing to be enough. But for me, it's like, okay.
Yeah, because there's this like chain, a thread or a chain, if you will, that he follows. And it's like, okay, I have this extra biblical evidence that points to this suggestion that there was a guy. Like, this is his point, that there was a guy. Once I go to the source material where it describes the guy and his story, I'm now buying that material. Whereas Alex is now seeing that as contested ground for the claims in which the miraculous resurrection and whatnot is showing up. If extra biblical sources in some way, or if an independent, and it could be shown to be independent, Alex isn't sure what he would do with the evidence if we did have it, because we would want experts who know how to evaluate that material to look at it and be able to help guide us. But suppose we found a stone inscription from 52, and we knew that it wasn't the Paul directly derived from 1 Corinthians 15. However, it is another piece of evidence that supports the idea that there were eyewitnesses of some kind of, visionary experience of Jesus external to the New Testament. What you could do is just say, well, some people had experiences and then they wrote down their names and inscribed it on stone, showing it. The problem is, and I'm just speaking out loud, I don't know what Alex would do, I would then turn to the Epidaurian tablets for Asclepius. Asclepius was in his stories was a physician, a mortal physician. Now, obviously, he had a father who was Apollo, but he was a physician, a mortal mother, and Apollo as his dad. He ends up dying because he's like resurrecting, keeping people from going to Hades. There's different stories about how it went down, but ultimately Zeus zaps him with a lightning bolt and brings him. Finally, he gets brought up to Mount Olympus. He's in heaven now. Mount Olympus is the Greek heaven. Many people would go to his temples in like an incubus type state. They would go into a slumber and surgery by the god would happen. Tumors, bones would be straightened out. Miracles would happen. written on stone as testimony to Asclepius's healing abilities. There were 12 stone slabs in the ancient world. Pausanias, a 2nd century geographer, talks about. We only have 4 of those remaining. I believe 4, if not 2, but I think 4. And on those stone slabs, there's a total of 140 miracles. So I believe it's 140. It might be double that because there's like 70 per slab, if I'm not mistaken. That's a lot more miracles described and written about Asclepius hundreds of years prior to Jesus, written by eyewitness testimony of the miracles that took place in the temple, yet you don't buy it. So I guess if we had more external evidence that a guy named Asclepius existed, that would help us say there was maybe a guy. But then what about all this extra, testimony about his miracles? I don't know.
If Jesus did not rise from the dead, it becomes much more difficult to explain why James, who didn't believe, converted, why Paul, who was a persecutor, converted, and why all of these scared and frightened apostles boldly proclaim this truth. I think it fulfills that explanatory datum here very well.
I understand what you're saying, Trent. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have enough reason to believe in the resurrection. I'm saying specifically the claim that you have as much good reason to believe that Jesus was alive before the crucifixion as afterwards.
Sure. Hey, I'm willing to dial that. I'm willing to trade that one for you're reasonable to believe in the resurrection. Secondly, I'm willing to make I'll make a trade on that.
Secondly, I find it really important when people talk about like the persecution of the apostles. You kind of get this merging between like people like Peter and people like Paul, like earlier you were talking about how, the persecution of the apostles is clear. If you look at Paul's letters, he talks very clearly about the persecutions he underwent, certainly so. But remember what Paul saw. Remember the nature of Paul's experience. It's a flash of light. Paul did not meet the bodily resurrected Jesus, and that's the claim that we're discussing, whether Jesus bodily resurrected from the dead. I don't want to say admit, you just assert as well as anyone else could that people can happily die for things that they think are true, but didn't see themselves. The whole point is that they need to have seen it themselves, and Paul did not see a bodily resurrected Jesus. Who's the earliest martyr? Who's the earliest Christian martyr?
Probably James. Well, Stephen would be the first martyr, and then James's description in Acts chapter 12.
It's Stephen, okay? And what is Stephen martyred for? Having a vision in the sky. He looks up and he sees Jesus stood or sat at the right hand of the Father, and he's stoned to death for it. The earliest martyrdom story we have is of a vision. The most obvious persecution that we have firsthand is that of Paul, whose experience was that of a vision. The idea of the physical resurrection of Jesus, even if we agree that Peter was persecuted, we don't know what it is that Peter saw. Yeah, we have some like second, third-hand accounts from the Gospels. That's if you believe the traditional authorship. But that's not the same thing as saying that that we know for a fact that an eyewitness to a specific event was persecuted for belief in that event. Even with James, we don't know why he was put to death. Surely, the most plausible conclusion is that he was preaching Christianity. Herod says that this was pleasing to the Jews when he kills James, but we just don't know the details, at least not strongly enough to believe in the miracle.
Josephus says that he was stoned to death for being a lawbreaker, and he's specifically referenced in Josephus as the brother of Christ, the one who is called Christ.
Yes, I understand that, but we just don't know the details of the reasons behind the martyrdom of this apostle. I think, although look, this is maybe a question for Sean McDowell. I just want to say that on the point of persecution, we need to be very careful about who we're talking about and keep it separate. Let's not say, look, we know that the apostles were persecuted because look at the letters of Paul. And we know that Paul was persecuted.
But it's not just that. We also have the testimony in the book of Acts, and we also have Tacitus talking about the Neronian persecution.
But then that's not firsthand. Right, you understand what I'm saying? Is that
it doesn't necessarily have to be firsthand, because I think there's good evidence that Luke was a traveling companion of Paul, and that he's a good historian.
Here we are again. This is why I do what I do. But no, go read Bart Ehrman's Counter Forgery. He covers a lot of the stuff in his own way. There's another guy. I've covered this in a documentary recently. Is Luke Acts an eyewitness? And I go through the we passages and discuss all this stuff. So he wasn't a traveling companion. Is there some journal behind the we passage stuff? And that the author, that's, I think, been debunked. Bart Ehrman points that out in Forgery, Counter Forgery. There's all sorts of stuff. But notice it's all really dependent upon this earlier material, very early, close to the times in which these things happen, reliable. Go read the Hermeneia commentary. Now, I know that I'm asking a big task there. You don't have to read the whole thing, but go find the passages specifically, talking about the we passages or many of the episodes in Acts. This author, according to Richard Purvo, knows the letters of Paul. He knows the letters of Paul. He's using them and, of course, reworking them in his own way. I think he's convinced me. There's like 74 examples that the book of Acts is borrowing from Paul's letters, and of course contradicts them in many ways.
Is that because of the we passages?
Yeah, I think that's one element to it. And I've read the critiques of people trying to say that's some kind of seagoing narrative motif. And I think there's
Vernon Robbins, by the way, and it's more than just the seagoing thing. And his face is like definitely not liking where this is going.
I wasn't going to go down that route. I was just going to say that, do you therefore reject the traditional authorship of John's gospel? Because near the end of John's gospel in John chapter 20, the beloved disciple is referred to seeing something, and the author of John's gospel says, and we know that his testimony is true. And given that we passages mean that it's speaking in the first person, that means that John was not authored by the beloved disciple, right?
It is possible that John was authored by someone else, like John the presbyter, that was part of the Johannine community. So I do think it provides other evidence. I don't think it's as strong as Luke, for example. But that's why, as I said before.
Damn, he thinks Luke's really strong. I'm not convinced at all on the Luke side. In fact, the first time any first person plural comes up is in Acts 16, I believe. There might be one mention prior, but when he's now getting on his journey onto a ship and he's heading out from Troas, the only other place you get a first person, and it's not a first person plural, it's a first person singular, is in Luke chapter 1 in the prologue. And it's not first person plural. This guy says that he's not only writing down in an orderly manner, but he has these sources, and that he has from eyewitnesses beforehand. He's supposedly getting like eyewitness testimony or eyewitness material, whether that's oral or written. I'm not sure how he's interpreting it or what exactly. We know he's using Mark. I think that there's a good reason to argue he's using Matthew. But this we stuff, when you, if you read that stuff carefully, you'll see the problems with the we passages.
I think that you don't want to take a dogmatic view when you're making a historical case.
Yes.
You're going to weigh things a little bit. And so
it's important because, I mean, John asked about the empty tomb, which I didn't have a chance to speak about. I wanted to, I mean, a moment ago, you said that, look, it's important to ask, what would you expect if it were true? And I agree with you. The data fits with what would happen if it were true. What I'm saying is it also fits with what would happen if it were not true. And in that position as an agnostic, I'm not going to believe in the resurrection, right? It might not be enough for a Christian to abandon faith.
Okay.
But I believe it. I believe it does, because I think there are other explanations. For example, looking at the empty tomb, this is really important, right? The empty tomb is like a key point here. Like, okay, I don't know if there was an empty tomb. I mean, I think just like prima facie, I have some suspicion that a member of the Sanhedrin could just like ask Pilate to take the body off the cross and like keep it for himself, when typically Romans would leave bodies on the cross as evidence of crucifixion. Maybe because it was a Jewish holiday. I mean, they say it's because of the Jewish holiday they take them down from the cross, as if Pilate cares about Jewish holidays. Maybe he does because he doesn't want to like incite a riot or something. Maybe. I'm not entirely sure. But let's just say that there were some kind of tomb. What's the nature of this tomb? We're told it's Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, only in Matthew's gospel. John's gospel seems to imply that it's specifically not Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. In fact, in John chapter 19, verse 38, it's Joseph and Nicodemus who are taking the body of Jesus. And it says, at the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation, this is the day before the Sabbath. So they had to solve this problem before the Sabbath began. That is, before Friday night. And there's this tomb that happens to be nearby. What do you think of the odds that a wealthy aristocrat like Joseph of Arimathea would own a tomb, not on his property, but near a crucifixion site for Roman criminals? That seems extremely unlikely. What's more likely is what John tells us, which is that there was a tomb nearby.
Tombs would be outside the city. It's an unclean site. And that's exactly what we find when we do archaeological investigations of Jerusalem. And you would have people executed outside of the city, outside of the gates.
I think what John is telling, but in terms of where you would put the remains, I think if Joseph...
Yeah, so what Alex is saying is, if you and I were getting a burial plot in a graveyard, we're not going to get buried in a graveyard right next to the prison, where like criminals literally die and they're being buried there too. especially in the ancient world. Like today, we don't care probably what happens to our bodies when we're dead. We're just kind of like, all right, cremate me or bury me or whatever. In those days, for religious reasons, and there was a lot of, it goes further back, but like what would happen to the body was very important to people in their experience in the afterlife as well. But to make this point, would a rich Joseph of Arimathea, who is this high up Jewish official, actually going to have his burial site be located near the criminal location where they're killing all these criminals and they're being crucified? Likely not. Just like you wouldn't want to be buried next to the nearby penitentiary, you might be located closer to a church or a synagogue or whatever the religion affiliation you might be acquainted with. That's his point. And then when you get to John, it doesn't say, well, Joseph of Arimathea is working overtime to do this. The justification for burying him in that area isn't that this is Joseph's tomb, but Joseph does play a role in the story. It's just interesting to see the difference.
Owns a tomb, it's unlikely to be near this site of crucifixion. And in fact, I think John's gospel is telling us that by saying that it's because it's the day of Jewish preparation. It doesn't. If this was just Joseph's tomb, why would it be because it was the Jewish day of preparation? And since the tomb was nearby, they put Jesus there. It seems to me that this is like an emergency burial in time for the Sabbath. When does the Sabbath end? It ends on Saturday night. So then the burial party come to this emergency tomb, take the body of Jesus and give it a proper burial. Early that morning, when it's still dark, so a few hours later, Mary comes along, sees an empty tomb, sees that the stone has already been rolled away, and says what? She assumes that the body has been taken. So there are two hypotheses here. One is that it's stolen. Some people think the body is stolen. We have good evidence for the stealing of bodies in the ancient world. You'll know about the Nazareth inscription, a 1st century Greek sort of legal inscription from an unknown Roman emperor, which issues the death penalty for people who steal bodies and tamper with tombs. So we know that in the ancient world, people were stealing bodies. We also have epitaphs on Jewish graves cursing people who steal bodies. We know that the stealing of bodies was something done popularly enough that they had to warn against it. We also know, of course, about the polemic in Matthew's gospel, which specifically says that there is a rumor that Jesus' body has been stolen. People are obviously believing this even by the time of the writing of Matthew's gospel. But it doesn't have to be. And you ask, well, who would steal it? One of the reasons people stole bodies was for use in like magical incantations, like magicians and the like. And of course, they specifically wanted people who'd undergone violent deaths. And the idea of a holy man who'd undergone a violent death would just be too tempting to give up. But even if you don't want to believe that, there's also the fact that the burial party of Jesus is said in John's gospel to have given him emergency burial right nearby the place because it was the Jewish day of preparation. And it's after the Sabbath that the tomb is now empty, and Mary Magdalene sees the tomb, and her first thought is that they've taken the Lord, and we do not know where they have put him. Like, I'm not going to say that the body was taken. I don't even know if there was an empty tomb, but if there were, the idea that it was taken either by a grave robber or by the burial party of Joseph of Arimathea is exceptionally more likely to me than that Jesus rose from the dead. Again, I won't say it didn't happen. I just want to say that that's a skeptical scenario, which seems to me perfectly plausible.
All right, before he jumps in, I gotta give credit to Trent though. I may disagree with this guy, but the mannerisms he has, you like literally, okay. Respect to anyone who's in good faith dialogue, debate, whatever, likes what's happening with Alex. The dude deserves some commending here, even if I disagree and think he's wrong. Now, to the YouTube video, Del Allison, it's a short, Junior, stolen body. And let's find the short. I have a short where he's describing they stole the body of Jesus. Let's see. I don't know the name of it, but I may have to just go on. Ooh, here it is. The most overlooked evidence of Jesus. No, here it is. There we go. Found it. All right. Bear with. This is worthy of showing. To back up the point, two things we have to mention. Del Allison Jr. Has this idea about the stolen bodies and magic and all that. And the other person is James Tabor, who points out the temporary burial location for the Jewish holiday, and they would have relocated it. And there's no way they'd be interested in going, hey, Peter, hey, yeah, we moved your guy to tomb B22. Yeah, that's B22. Got it? All right. They're not going to tell him where they're relocating the body. And it could have been in a common grave, or it could have been into another actual tomb location, more permanent. Let me show you the video here. This is Dale Allison Jr. Years. I think I was still in North Carolina here when I recorded this with him.
Didn't rise from the dead and the tomb really, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead and the tomb really was empty, what happened to his body? Because I'm like, wow, you actually
look. So N.T. Wright admits tomb robbery was fairly common in the ancient world. We have a number of inscriptions which are prohibiting people from moving bodies. We have lots of magical papyri where you're supposed to use body parts from people who died violently, right? And yeah, so if I were a skeptic, I thought the tomb were empty, I would just say that. And by the way, if this were tomb robbers, they're not going to put the stone back in place. They're going to hurry up and they're going to run away. You know, that place in the Gospel of John where the garments are sort of rolled up, you know, in a nice, neat pile. I actually think that's probably an early attempt to say it's not tomb robbers.
If Jesus didn't rise from the...
Anyway, there's a short. I put that out a long time ago because I thought, interesting, listening to a scholar who obviously has been known in New Testament studies, a respectable New Testament scholar who happens to be a Christian, also then said, if I was a skeptic, I would think the tomb robber explanation makes the most sense. Here you have tomb robber explanation and temporary burial hypothesis side by side with Alex. You could add in the fictional side of legend and that there wasn't really even a tomb, that the tomb was an invented idea. Paul says he was buried, but it doesn't talk about a tomb. And you can see the development happening and why the Gospels would have added this. I also think looking at, I always butcher the name, Callery, I always butcher this. There's a novel, first century novel that talks about an empty tomb and the woman who is been abused by her husband that gets buried in it. Tomb robber still the body, but he believes she had become divine because the tomb was empty. This is a first century novel. It's a fiction. And I think that idea being contemporaneous with an empty tomb story of the Gospels, at least in a heuristic way, can help us measure or look to the gospel narratives and think, is this fiction? Is this empty tomb story doing something more fictive, more mythological? And that's where resurrection and reception also comes to mind with Richard C. Miller, where he highlights that bodies going missing as a significant detail that they have been translated. They have become gods. And I think that's why they have a missing body from the tomb in Mark right out the gate. They're showing this guy has become deified. All right. Let us continue. We're almost done. Almost done. Feel free to super chat, questions, comments, whatever. And before we wrap up, we'll get to them.
Trent, can I just give you a few minutes to respond to those claims about the empty tomb?
Of course. And I would just say, Alex, yes, what you are doing here is essentially you're being a clever barrister for the atheist cause that you don't have to prove. You're just, creating doubt. Perhaps this other thing happened.
I just lack a belief.
Well, but that's the thing. I think, though, when we're looking, we could say something did happen here. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to comment on what you said earlier. You could say, yeah, sure, resurrection explains all the data, but so does no resurrection. But I would say no resurrection is not a hypothesis. It is an umbrella under which you would put specific hypotheses that would have to be weighed upon their merits and the data that they do explain. And
he keeps saying something happened here, and sure, that's a possible answer, that there's something that happened, and I'm not, but like, I asked this question even hypothetically, then did something happen for the celebration of the Hilaria festival? Each year they believed in this, in like repeating at Easter time, the death and the resurrection or the revivification of the god Attis, that he was dead and 3 days later he is alive again. This is in the Attis festival, the Hilaria festival. And this was implemented by Claudius in the 50s AD across the Roman Empire. So I ask myself, something must have happened here, right? that caused them to really go out of their way to flagellate themselves, to believe he died, and that they're ceremonially, ritualistically believing he rose again and that they also will live, that they will have life because he lives. There's something happened here, right? We're talking about ancient cult, mythic set, eros, gamos, if you will, sacred lore, all sorts of stuff that I think should be factored in at least as on the buffet of the table as options to choose from. And he's acting like this is like a clever way of combating the resurrection. I think it's just the most obvious, more likely answers are not that this literal resurrection took place, that there might be a literary way to explain it, or an alternative hypothesis that explains the tomb where they relocate him, or they stole the body. All of that just seems more likely. It's not like we're just trying to fight it. It just seems more likely at the end of the day than a literal resurrection.
That there is no single explanation. Usually what skeptics have to do is they must conjoin different things.
Yep.
So missing body along with group hallucinations. And when you start conjoining hypotheses, that lowers their probability when you do that. So you I would say for people, okay, look at it. Resurrection explains it. What other things do explain it? And you'll start to run into problems of starting to squish and ignore the data or compress it.
What do you do? Okay, let's reverse that. If coming up with multiple ways to try and explain it, and maybe he's right, maybe we don't need to run around with this hallucination model on top of this model on top of this, and there's all these different things that lowers the probability. Even though they might be true, it doesn't mean it's not true. It just lowers our probability of being able to ascertain for sure if that happened. Reverse it. Well, when you compare the accounts of the Gospels and you see the growing literature within the text itself, then the probability that the historical evidence points to what's being depicted in John or Luke is unlikely. You have other explanations and competing versions of Gospels and Paul that don't line up. So you have a problem that you have to deal with. How are you going to explain away the contradictions? Doesn't that lower the probability of the likeliness of one of them being true? Or does it just mean, nope, one of them's true for sure, but all the others might not be as accurate or something? Like there's a lot of problems in the reverse. They love to throw this out, but the reverse is problematic as well.
So when it comes to like body theft, you're correct. There are inscriptions warning against grave robbery, but grave robbery was primarily about valuables that might be left in a grave, specifically things like the linens or the tunics. There are these, and so what's surprising then, of course, is in our narratives, those things are left behind. Or when you have necromancers who would steal bodies. You're correct. They're not necessarily in Judea. This seemed to be more outside of Judea. You have spellcasters, necromancers. We have found skulls with like candles inside of them that could be evidence of necromancy. But normally that's what they would do. They just cut off the head. And especially if you're going to take that, just cut the head off. That's all you need for the spell. Just leave the body. Or hey, if you're going to be there anyways, and you're a dubious fellow who's into witchcraft, you might like some free garments that are super expensive in the ancient world. Take that with you as well. So I would say, there's no nice Walmart to go to get stuff here. You don't think that there are people who found a corpse on the side of the, they're not Jewish, but pagan maybe. But hey, if you're a grave robber, you're a grave robber. You find linen.
Depends on how nice the linen is, right? I mean, it seems like Joseph and Nicodemus were doing a bit of an emergency burial. They probably just threw him in whatever they could find. I'm sure the fact of the matter is just having that kind of stuff, you would want to get that and steal it. That's what I think most of the inscriptions are dealing with here.
Thank you, Beachcomber, for being a member for 3 months. Does Trent want Alex to prove no resurrection? I think that is kind of the point, is like one is saying there's a resurrection, one is saying there's not, but it seems most of this was centered around bodily resurrection and visionary bodily experience. Like did Paul see the body? Now, Trent kind of avoided this whole debate. He suggested, but he didn't really dive into like Paul experienced exactly the physical bodily resurrection we see in Luke and John. He believes that, I imagine, but he didn't really like die on that hill. And it seemed that Alex wanted to point in the direction of taking the whole physical body appearances to task and saying there's a more likely a case that these are visionary experiences. which would then go down a hallucination route or some kind of mystical, I don't know, you could say a dream, you could say half awake, meditative experience, whatever, that they think they experienced Christ. So, yeah, in a way, you could say that it's proving no resurrection, or he's trying to make him argue it, but it's more about the bodily thing. And how do you debunk a visionary experience, right? Other than say they're clearly hallucinating or there's a psychological, experience that makes sense of it. What he'll say is, oh, there's no group hallucination. Like there's no such thing as group hallucinations. And he supposedly appeared to 12 at once, right? There are works that are done by people who study the brain, who explain group setting observations and their experiences. Obviously, they're probably not seeing the exact same thing in each other's brains, but there is a phenomena here to be explored for humans on how they're perceiving a similar experience, even if it is a bit different. So, yeah, anyway, I think that's what's going on here, Beach. Thank you for being a member.
But when it comes to someone being in a tomb, that, as I said before, that's not implausible. We have the Yehoanan evidence from that skeleton that was found. So clearly the idea like, oh, why would they give the body to someone, a Jew, to be buried? It did happen. So we have previous precedent for that going on. So yeah, I think that when we're
for Romans giving a crucified body
to someone to bury it. That it wasn't simply left on a cross, that it could be given a proper burial in a tomb. So we know that did happen. So it's not out of the bounds for someone to request that, in this case, someone like Joseph of Arimathea.
And that would be in keeping, in fairness to you, Trent, that would be in keeping with, I don't believe it's historical, but the Gospels want to say that Pilate sort of increasingly distances himself from responsibility for the death of Jesus. And so if he really did feel as guilty as he said in the Gospels to do so, then maybe somebody asking for a proper burial would make him go like, yeah, okay, sure, have that. It'll make me feel a little bit better.
His wife might have bugged him.
His wife
said, I had a horrible dream, and this man, I want nothing. And that's why she's actually venerated as a saint in the Eastern Christian Church because of that.
Dude, if that doesn't tell me like there's a more likely legendary explanation behind the visionary stuff and all that, it makes me feel more fictive. If that's the case and that's the path they're going to go down, it feels more like a fictional story. One hell of a fictional story, but Trent's buying it literally. And it sounds like Alex is playing with it, trying to play with the historical, doing the historical research. But I'm looking at that going, okay, that sounds more like a damn good story. That's just me. We have different, I guess you'd say, foundations from which we're jumping at this material.
Of course, I don't think Pilate, like in any story other than the Gospels, we have we don't get any idea of Pilate as someone who's like a compassionate man who obviously cares very much about his wife and cares about this man Jesus. I think he was a ruthless leader who couldn't give a squat about Jesus.
When I read the history about him, I find he is someone who's constantly embattled with the Jewish authorities and dealing with them, and they're a giant headache for him. Like when the golden plates that Philo describes, they had an image of Caesar on it that were brought into Jerusalem, and there's a whole riot about it. And Pilate does not just drop the hammer on the Jews in response to that. He has to play politics there. So I think that fits in also with the historical data.
Well, speaking of golden plates, I'm just kidding.
And by the way, one of the witnesses, David Whitmer, said God told him Mormonism was a false church. We don't find anything like that with the apostles.
Well, Joseph Smith's Mormonism was a false church, but he still saw an angel give the golden plates. The golden plates were real. The angel Moroni was real. It's just that Joseph Smith's religion was false.
And it could be natural explanation of heightened, we're in the woods playing with our eyes closed, seeing with the eyes of faith, or demonic in the sense that, look, if I was the devil, I'd want to make a religion that says, you don't believe Jesus is God, and you don't even pray to Jesus, because
pulling out devils and demons to explain this. Interesting.
Mormonism, you don't pray to Jesus.
It's similar to how, when Martin Luther brings about Protestantism, it would be one thing for him to say, I think these Catholics are wrong and I don't believe in God and I don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus. It's another thing to say, I think that their religious interpretation is incorrect. And it's because of my belief. It's because of the strength of my belief in the original message that I want to be able to say this. I don't know, man. I feel like somebody who, I think you've got a reverse Paul, which I think is even stronger. For example, if Paul was said to have gone the other way around, if Paul was a Christian and then fell out with Peter, fell out with the early church, decided that Christianity is bogus, but he still saw the risen Christ. He was in like excommunication with the early Christian community, but he just couldn't, until the day he died, couldn't deny that he'd seen this vision. I think that'd be exceptionally strong evidence in favor of the resurrection.
But the problem is with Whitmer, he says God confirms one religion, and then he says God confirmed another religion to him. I'm going to believe God over Whitmer in saying that if you're going to...
Okay, real quick, I need to give you a quick story. He was debating Joshua Bowen and Kip Davis once, and I brought this up in videos in the past. If you haven't heard it, I'm just going to repeat it real quick. And he was talking about slavery in the Hebrew Bible. And Joshua Bowen points out that the Hammurabi Code says that you can own a person for 3 years, the indentured servitude, 3 years, but you have to let them go after the third year. In the Bible, it's 6 years. Trent spent 5 minutes justifying why the Bible is more morally superior and gave hypotheticals on why that might be the case, because the ancient world sucked and people were hungry and you didn't have a place to live and they needed, so the slave master had to, take care of all these things to justify why the Bible had twice the amount of time, 6 years, and then released them on the 7th instead of 3 years and released them on the 4th in Hammurabi. And Joshua Bowen told me off record after the live stream, he's just like, Derek, if the Bible would have said 3 years and Hammurabi said 6, do you honestly think Trent Horn would have spent all that time saying what he said, or would he have just said, come on, man, Hammurabi's got twice the amount of time to owning a slave? And I was like, I think you're 100% right. Just like the super chatter earlier was mentioning, saying stuff like, if the canon had the Gospel of the Gospel of Peter in it, and it says, let's pretend that the interpretation is correct, that it's a giant cross that comes out from behind Jesus out of the tomb. If it was canon, what would Trent do? How would he justify that narrative? Would he be calling it fable and fiction and completely embellished? Or would he be trying to defend it and couch it within somehow realistic terms? Because God can do anything and all of that stuff. It's what apologetics seems to do all the time.
Use God of these direct kind of contradictions. It more shows a problem with your character and testimony.
Gentlemen, it's been a fascinating discussion of Mormonism. Thank you for watching Unbelievable on web.
Okay, real quick, we got a super chat here. I'm going to see what's left, but I don't want to leave anyone. Ontological Shock, thank you for being here, for being a member. Thank you for the support. If the gospel writers wanted to downplay the grave robbers hypothesis, they could have made up the idea Jesus's grave coverings were left in the tomb. Hold on, let me read that again. If the gospel writers wanted to downplay the grave robbers hypothesis, they could have made up the idea Jesus's grave coverings were. That's the point. No, that I was trying to reread that so I understood. That's actually the point I think Allison is saying about the Gospel of John. And that is that in the Gospel of John, when they get to the tomb, the shroud is like rolled up very neatly or whatnot. Whether it's neatly or not, neatly probably is the detail that sticks out to Allison, but they clearly left the coverings in the tomb, which I think is an important point that, they want you to think that he is gone. And I don't know if they identify the shroud in great detail as if it's like still there, the way that you see the famous, where's my intro? I think in my intro, I have a scene where the body of Jesus. You've seen like crucifixion, the Passion of the Christ movie with the resurrection scene. You see like the shroud slowly deflate when the light hits it, like as if his body was just disappeared now, or it came out of it. Now he's going to walk out of the tomb. You kind of have to ask yourself that question. Like, if the gospel writers wanted to downplay the grave robbers hypothesis, they could have made up the idea that Jesus's grave coverings were left in the tomb. I hope I'm answering your question properly. I'm a bit confused on what you're specifically trying to get at here. Ontological, I'm looking in the chat. Let me know if I'm answering this properly. If you're saying what I think you're saying, that is that they would have made up the coverings and left them in the tomb. Help me out. I want to make sure that I'm getting you properly here, because I'm a bit confused after rereading it. I want to make sure I'm reading this properly. Let's see what happens just throwing it into AI, making sure I'm. If Christians or gospel writers were worried people would claim Jesus' body was stolen by grave robbers, they could have invented a detail to make that explanation look unlikely, that the burial cloths were still left inside the tomb. In other words, the argument is a grave robber would probably steal the body with the wrapping still on it, because stopping to unwrap a corpse inside a tomb would be weird, risky, disgusting, and time-consuming. So when the Gospel of John says the linen cloths were left behind in the tomb, that detail can function apologetically, like Allison was saying. So I was thinking that was what your point was. It makes the someone stole the body explanation seem less plausible, for sure. A simpler, yeah. So that makes a lot of sense. Am I right in answering that? I hope you're still. Yeah, I am understanding you correctly. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, so that's what Allison's point was, is that it signals to him that the author of John is trying to make you or anyone who might doubt that he did resurrect not think that, because look how the shroud is there. It's neatly wrapped up or folded, rolled up, however. Grave robber wouldn't go through that great detail to do all that. They would just take it and that would be it. Mark, on the other hand, could function that way. Mark doesn't do all of that. The women get there. There's this young man. He says he is raised. Clearly that would be legend, but the tomb is already rolled away. There's who knows what's happened between the time they've come to them on that morning of the Sunday in the tomb. They don't know. It's a mystery. There's a lot of mystery, a lot of in storytelling, there's a lot of open room to make stuff up or to explain details. It's kind of like what happened with Enoch in the Genesis account. He walked with God, and for 365 years he lived, and then he was not, for God took him. Then you get entire books. One Enoch, the Book of the Watchers, the Similitudes. You get all sorts of stuff that's written in the name of Enoch to explain this mysterious person whose narrative isn't really, it's got a lot of plot holes. In that scenario, you got an empty tomb. You walk up, the stone's already rolled away. He's not in there. I don't think it mentions a shroud in Mark at all. Let me see where the earliest mention, which gospel is the earliest to mention a shroud, and I'm going to say after his resurrection, because he's obviously being buried. And what with burial preparation, they bring spices and all that kind of stuff later, if I'm not mistaken. I know in John they try to come and bring burial stuff. The earliest canonical gospel to mention burial clothes, shroud after the resurrection is probably Luke, not John, assuming the usual dating order where Luke is earlier than John. Luke 24:12 says, Peter ran to the tomb and saw the linen cloths lying by themselves. Notice it's plural, but Peter got up and ran to the tomb, stopping and looking in. He saw the linen cloths by themselves. And John says he saw the linen cloths lying there and the face cloth. So John adds the face cloth. But if Luke and John are right, the Shroud of Turin, which we already know is bogus, but for the Shroud of Turin fans out there, you got a face cloth separate from the body cloth, and they're all running around with this picture of Jesus on the Shroud of Turin. Anyway, Mark, the earliest gospel overall, but it only says Joseph wrapped Jesus in a linen cloth at burial in Mark 15:46. It does not mention the cloths or the clothes still being in the empty tomb. Matthew mentions Joseph wrapping Jesus in a clean linen cloth in Matthew 27:59, but does not mention burial clothes in the empty tomb. So it's Luke and John that mention it. Interesting. All right. Let's see if there's any other nuggets from this discussion. We're getting to the end.
The Mormonism is true. Actually, going back to the resurrection,
Yes.
I do have one final question for you, Alex, and I've got a final question for you, Trent, as well. Alex, what would it take for you to believe in the resurrection? What standard of evidence, what quantity of evidence would you like to see for you to put your faith in this?
I don't know if there's any particular instance. Of course, if I had a Damascus experience of my own, even if it were just visionary. But I was told to, believe in this particular narrative, which I suppose is the kind of thing Trent must believe happened to Paul. He didn't see the physical Jesus, but maybe Jesus kind of like told him that he was physical when he resurrected. I know not now.
Notice he keeps pressing Trent on Paul's experience of Jesus was not a bodily, physical. It's a visionary. It's a light. It's a bright, beaming light. And clever of Alex to constantly bring that up. And Trent's not pushing back on that. You'll notice he constantly allows it. And I think Trent knows that the book of Acts constantly gives the portrayal of the experience for Paul. And it's never the bodily appearance. It's always a visionary, bright light thing.
But like I was at one point, and you will be at one point, and go and ask Peter about it rather than just appearing physically himself.
Alex, what if you were with Stephen Woodford and you saw this stuff and Stephen said, what the hell was that voice going on? Like I couldn't see everything, but what was that about? Would that increase your credence a bit?
I am not sure that it would, no.
I should have picked a better witness there to be
No, I know. I love Steve. I wouldn't think that he was lying, but unless I thought it myself.
Just saying, because you could worry like, oh, I saw something, maybe my mind's playing tricks on me. Acts chapter 9's reference of Paul's testimony says it wasn't purely a subjective experience that his traveling companions saw a light. They saw something also. Look, it's not purely mental.
By the reason I say this might convince me, is because visions can be true. This is a big Dale Allison point, right? Like, we often think that like if something's visionary, it's therefore false. Visions can be true. Maybe all of the appearances to the disciples were all visionary. Maybe when they went up the mountain, they saw a vision of Jesus. Maybe the 500 saw Jesus above them, as the Greek may imply. I'm not going to die on that hill either. But
could have been above them on a hill.
It doesn't. It could have been above them on a hill. Could have been more than 500 people, and it was above them. Who knows? But what I want to say is that doesn't mean that it's false, right? It could be like a real vision. Real visions are supposed to happen in the Gospels. God warns Joseph in a dream in the infancy narrative, and we're not told. We don't think that he was like mistaken just because it was a visionary experience. So that would be fine. So something like that. But historically speaking, I think that evidence of particular apostles if we had first-hand testimony to experience of the bodily resurrected Christ, and also good evidence that those apostles were persecuted and martyred for that particular belief, not just being a Christian, not just spreading the message of Christ, but specifically the belief in the resurrection, who was sort of persecuted for that reason, I think that would be great evidence. I don't know if that'd be enough to convince me, but I think I probably wouldn't want to do a debate like this on the matter, because it would be incredibly difficult to defend against, I think. But we just don't have that kind of evidence. We have, at best, sort of second-hand account. We have first-hand accounts of visionary experiences, or at best, second-hand accounts of experiences which seem to be physical on one reading, but seem maybe not to be on others. And that just isn't enough for me to place my faith and trust in Jesus of Nazareth, at least the post-resurrected Jesus of Nazareth.
And Trent, I'm going to give you the final word. What in your mind is the kind of the strongest piece of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus?
I think the strongest piece of evidence is the uniqueness of the proclamation itself, that you would, and N.T. Wright talks about this in his book on Jesus, that if the apostles merely said, I've seen Jesus in heaven, they might say, of course, he's in Abraham's bosom. He's with all the righteous waiting in heaven. No, I really felt his presence. Yeah, we feel them praying for us and interceding for us. That's not enough to proclaim this fact, this idea of bodily resurrection that was reserved for the eschaton, reserved for the end of the world. For them to proclaim that boldly and uniquely, I would say there has to be something. It's not just as followers, but also a persecutor who showed no signs of guilt or remorse, but simply had this interaction with Jesus that other people were privy to. So not purely a mental interaction. I think all of that together, we need to seek out what is the best explanation for that. And that, look, they were either sincere or insincere. I don't think, even though we've quibbled about the martyrdom stuff, I think most critics do not believe insincere. They would go with sincere. And then do we say, okay, sincere, they did see something or they didn't see something? The fact that we have all this different evidence for not just individuals, but groups, cross-referencing it, being able to check a tomb that is locatable nearby to see what happened to the body. And finally, and I would...
Yeah, but that literally was the point that Alex was bringing up earlier. There's no verifying a temporary relocated tomb, or if there was obviously a stolen body, but you wouldn't be able to verify it if it was temporarily buried and then relocated. But he gets the final word and Alex can't chime in. I can. And I think he's just missing that point, or he's just giving his final word for the viewer who might be, soaking in what's being said.
Encourage Alex to talk about this, and maybe he'll dive deeper into it in an episode of the show, or we'll talk about it. Or you could have an academic on who specializes in this. I think the Christian miracles that have gone on later in history, including what I mentioned at the beginning of the show, like look, you're worried, like, well, do we have first and second hand? Look, we've got newspaper accounts of people at Fatima not just seeing that, but saying their clothes miraculously dried, puddles dried up. We've got photographs of the apparition at Zaytun. So what worries me is, like, in some respects, we do have that better firsthand photographic newspaper evidence of these supernatural things. My concern, and I guess for any skeptic who is watching, I would say, look, you're looking for likely things. Be open-minded and ask yourself, look, what's more probable here? All supernatural accounts are false, or at least one of them is true. And if at least one of them is true, perhaps you shouldn't at least be a strict naturalist, and then just follow the evidence from there.
Well, Trent Horn, Alex O'Connor, it's been such a rich discussion. Thank you so much for coming on Unbelievable.
Thanks, Trent. Thanks for joining us in trans-physical form. It's been fun.
Well, I'm glad this group of people could attest that I'm here and it wasn't simply made up. Then we had a thorough historical investigation.
If anybody doubts that, some of them are still alive. So just go and ask them, even though you don't know who they are.
I'd stake my life on it that we had a good discussion, and hopefully we'll have others in the future.
I hope so too.
Definitely. Thank you.
Okay. There you have it. There's the debate recently. Fun debate. I thought it was interesting. There was a comment by I saw a comment earlier about Luke Acts that I thought was good. Scrolling up. The author of Acts, there you go, would have been inclined to say it was more subjective considering they already believed in Jesus. Let's look at Acts. Let's look at Acts. Get to the right studio. So in Acts 9, listen to what it says, right? It seemed like, and I may be reading Trent wrong here, but Paul is breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, and went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Israel or to Jerusalem. Now, as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. This is omniscient narration, like this is fictive, but either way, I digress. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? This is mimesis. If you go read the old King David, King Saul interaction in the Old Testament, there's an article called Better Call Paul Saul. Michael Koshinosh wrote it, highlighting that this is a rewrite of Old Testament scripture. All right, where Saul, literally, the King Saul, is persecuting King David. Okay. And Jesus is a son of David. And what is the name of Paul before he gets renamed? Saul. Anyway, it's literary. But let's look at the phenomena itself, and look at this phenomenon and look carefully and see, is anyone else seeing this here? Not in this case. And it seemed like the example that Trent brought up was Acts 9. So now as approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground, heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? So Paul is hearing. He saw a bright light and he's hearing. He asked, who are you, Lord? The reply came, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city and you will be told what you are to do. The men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice but saw no one. So they heard something, but they saw nothing. Now, you take this literally to the bank. That's what Trent expects. If you take this experience and try to explain how two other people, let's just say there's two there, and they could hear but could not see, but the person who's blinded can see and can hear whatever this experience is, how do you explain that naturally? That seems to be what the apologetic is trying to do. And I personally would say, well, the natural explanation is this is a literary work. I don't need to go in and try and explain why two guys could hear something and this guy could. The guy's blinded by a bright light out of nowhere and can't see. And then just a few verses later, he gets miraculously healed and the scales fall from his eyes and he can see again. Like, Like, why is the text even believable at this point? Why are we not going, hold on. What are we reading? Fundamentally, before we try to take an experience that's being described in a text, what are we reading? Is this really history? Did this really happen? Or is this not a fiction? Is this not obviously literary in nature and not literal history? That's how I would look at it, ontological. And I think you probably would agree. I don't know if you do, but that's how I would approach it. I'm looking at it going, Anyway, I hope everybody enjoyed, the show. I mean, that was fun. The Michael guy is just there to take a piss and chat. He doesn't care to have a real dialogue, just another troll. I don't know who that is. This Michael. Oh, quantum tunneling. Gotcha. You guys are debating in the chat. Got it. Axe got people acting fools. Yes, indeed. Yeah, for sure. I'm scrolling up. If there's any other questions, ask them. Or so help me Jesus, I'm out. I'm going to go eat dinner. Any other questions? Ask away while I'm here. I'll be happy to answer if I know the answer. If I don't, I'll tell you I don't know. But again, I feel like there's a lot of stuff. You can play different paths. You can go down different roads to try and explain the data. And, all of them are possible. Some are more plausible. The least likely to me is that a literal resurrection happened in like miraculous terms. That's to me. I don't know what dinner is. I'm not sure. I'm not really sure yet. I think the Queen is probably going to surprise me with something. Who knows? Thanks for the question. Mormons loved your religion, Christopher Derrick. Mormons loved your religion. Don't know enough about the Marcion material that is, being removed. It depends on what path you take too, because if Marcion's redacting Jewish prophets, I think M. David Litwa, who's someone who thinks that Marcion wrote his gospel prior, or his gospel's older than the Luke version, and it might be much messier than I'm painting it, doesn't think that he's like an enemy of the Old Testament. I think he sees that Old Testament stuff's there. He just didn't have as much, and that Luke pads it out with a lot more. The resurrection thing is interesting. I just talked to Vincent earlier. I was asking him about dating Ignatius. No, not Ignatius. Was it Ignatius? No. The letter to the Smyrnaeans, Ignatius's letter. Yeah. He thinks it's around 170, which is late. But yeah, Marcus Vincent thinks resurrection is a later idea, that it wasn't really in the earliest material. I don't know what to make of it. I mean, if the earliest material was coming from a Jewish movement within Judaism, and Paul brings in resurrection, interesting. Interesting. But again, if you're thinking in line with people like Marcus Vincent, Jack Bull, Mark Bilby, and M. David Little and others, and they think that the letters we have of Paul aren't really what was originally the letters of Paul, that Paul had a different theology prior to that, and that, Marcion's material might have come first. I don't know if all of them in the crowd are Marcion priority types, but, then you have a whole different question. I don't know. This is way above my pay grade, and I've never studied this in depth from Marcus Vincent. Thank you so much. Happy birthday. Keep up the great work. Thank you so much. Also have a great day and evening, Chad. I genuinely hope you're all able to get by and enjoy your time on this pale blue dot. Facts. Love the Goku. I think that's Goku. Love the Goku image there as well. Big DBZ guy myself. Derek, you should review some of the videos criticizing the upcoming Odyssey movie. Well, I know there's a lot of people who obviously aren't fans of some of the historical problems with it, like characters that likely wouldn't be characters in the movie that they have acting, or even some of the armor, which I'm not a classicist who knows like the actual armor that was worn by Bronze Age people from this region fighting in the Trojan region and whatnot. So like there is a lot of that. I could review it, but overall, the biggest complaints I hear is that this actress or this actor would not have fit that role in history. Those are the biggest ones I hear. And then the other is the armor that was worn by Agamemnon. I've come across. Well said, Derek. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. I was thinking along the same lines. I kind of figured you might be based on what I was reading. I was trying to multitask. Let's see. Who's the more foolish, the fool or the fool who follows him? Depends on if the fool is intentionally trying to put on the fool. He's not really a fool, but he's acting like one, and they're buying it. Any good scholarly books on One Enoch other than Apocalyptic Imagination by John J. Collins, which I read last month? Yeah, let me pull up. Yeah, I think it's. I can't remember his name right now off the top of my head. Nichols, I think. There's another guy named. Let me see if I can't find it here. Sorry. Yeah, George W.E. Nicholsberg. And then you have James C. Vanderkam. He's another really good one. There's a lot, actually. Let me put this in the chat for you. There's one right there. There's also another interesting one is Gabriel Boccaccini. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that. His is interesting because he sees One Enoch is made of 5 books, that there was a competitive Judaism against Torah Judaism. So you had 5 books of Moses, you had 5 books of Enoch, and there's competition between these two Jewish movements. He wrote a book that covers this. It's way more nuanced, I imagine, and complex than I'm even laying it out right now. That's worth checking out if you're interested in kind of a broader reading of all that. But James Vanderkam is another one, along with, as you rightly pointed out, John J. Collins. I think he's absolutely one of the goods here. Let me give you the other name. Yep. All right. That should have come in. Thank you for the question. All right. Let me scroll down here and make sure. Yeah. Thanks for the happy birthday too. I forgot to mention that. No worries. Look, I just titled this a part 2 to part 1 from yesterday. My birthday was Sunday, so just turned 38. Yeah. How did you get Trent to engage with you? I did a video actually criticizing Trent's video where he was bringing up mythicism, but the way he did it was like pretty much zeitgeist. He had the really low-hanging fruit approach to it, and I was like, no, look, I'm not a mythicist, but I felt like he didn't do it right, and I came at him kind of strong. It was a video he was reacting to Dan McClellan about, and then I emailed him and said, hey, I'd like to do an episode. I'd like to have a discussion with you, and sorry if I came off strong. And he's just saying, no, dude, you treat me way better than many Christians did. So that was really good news. I'm like, wow, he's getting abuse from Christians, whereas I was just coming at him critical. And he's like, I'd like to have you come down in studio. We both have family members who have struggles right now with personal health issues. I don't want to give his information out there, but I have a family member who's stage 4 cancer. So I had to go visit my mother-in-law, and I'm going to have to visit her several times this year because this is probably going to be her last year alive. And I want to make sure that my wife gets to spend time with her mom before she passes. So we're making several trips. And I told him when things free up, I'll fly down to Texas in studio and get to actually record with Trent in person. I think he's actually a great guy. After listening to him, even though I disagree with him, I think he's wrong. I think he's actually carries himself in an authentic manner as a kind human being. And maybe we'll get to see that when I go to visit him in person. I don't know him personally, just keeping it real, but that's my impression of him online. Derek, what do you think? Could Ignatius be foreshadowing Kitos War, definitely placing him prior to 115 CE? I don't know enough about the scholarship behind Ignatius. According to Vincent, when I wrote him, he thinks that there was, I think, 7 letters total, and the last 3 letters are like 170-ish. I don't know how early he places some of that stuff. Now, mind you, Vincent is radical in his positions compared to the consensus often. So I don't know what I know the consensus puts Ignatius somewhere like 107 up to like 107 to 107 to 115 or something. I'm off memory. So I really don't know what, letter this might be referring to that might be foreshadowing Quito's War. I know his letter to the Romans is wild and complete death by cop sounding. It's pretty wonky to me. But yeah, you would know more than I would about that. Awesome. Thanks, dude. I appreciate it. I'm almost the same age. I turned 38 in September. Awesome. Yeah. I feel it these days more than I did before. Celebrity Deathmatch needs a comeback. I remember that show. We need Jesus versus Thor. Yeah. Absolutely. He seems to be constantly asking people to rally behind church fathers, and Polycarp attacks Docetists. It's thematic. What do you think? I think there's an absolute pushback against certain versions of Christianity, and they play a significant role in that. I brought that up earlier in the video when I was getting the quotes from him and Polycarp about this. We call it Docetism, but there might be other forms, kind of like Gnosticism has different categories of people under that umbrella. There are people who seem to have had more of a pneumatic body, not the physical fleshly body. They had what I think Paul was thinking in mind. I don't think Paul's dealing with the corpse of Jesus in the flesh and blood body that he went into the grave, came out, and that's alive and that's immortal, and that body with that substance is there. I think that like a seed in the ground sheds off. But you're specifically asking about rallying church fathers. It could be. And if some of these scholars think this stuff is forged in the name of these fathers and they didn't really write this material, how much more propagandistic can you get? How much more propagandistic can you get when you're manufacturing fathers and letters in order to back your claims up? And these are the letters that won out history, Amy, good to see you. Ironically, Jonathan Rumi, the Chosen's Jesus, did the voices for Celebrity Deathmatch. Interesting. I did not know that. Wild. That's wild. Oh, Steve, thank you. What do you think of Jacob's multiple Paul theory? At first, I was like, nah, like I'm not buying it. But I think where I might not follow him is looking to Josephus in explaining Acts for the Saul stuff. But I do agree that you do get different Pauls. It's the same guy, but they're rewriting him. He's not. So the Paul in Paul's letters, you can argue that the Paul in the forged letters are a different kind of Paul as well. But like the Paul, let's just go with two Pauls for a second. The Paul in Acts and the Paul in Paul's own letters they don't think the same way. They're not the same guy. They don't act the same. It is the same character, but they clearly are rewriting Paul. So I took that. I walk away from what Jacob's saying and saying that. But I think almost all critical scholars would agree with what I'm saying about that. I think, and I could be wrong, that Jacob goes one step further, specifically addressing the idea about Saul in Josephus, this guy named Saul. And then he thinks there's something to do with Paul in Acts. And I can't remember everything that Jacob brings to the table, but that there was accusations that Paul might have been behind the death of James. If that's the case, that's another Paul that we're not seeing, right? Okay. Sorry, I was getting a call. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think we're going to find disagreements, but we have a lot of agreement and overlap as well. Wade Rogers, thank you so much for the super chat. Good to see you, Wade. I appreciate the membership as well. Sorry I'm late to the party, but wanted to send some love. Sounds like an epic Myth Vision. We just got done reviewing. This is the second part video. live stream, Alex O'Connor versus Trent Horn. And I just add my commentary in and my thoughts about things as I go. I'm just keeping it real with you where I'm at. And yeah, you might enjoy this episode, Wade, because Alex is clever. He's a very clever thinker. And he goes into Mormonism, kind of uses Mormonism, not because he believes it, but it's like he uses it as a weapon to the thought of the apologist for Christianity who aren't Mormons. And it's clever. Very clever approach, I think. And I mean, there's so many things he brings up in this. So many. Like a transfiguration episode for like Joseph Smith becomes where the prophet, what's his name? The one that follows in the footsteps of Joseph Smith. My brain is definitely shot. I'm trying to think. Brigham Young. There's like a transfiguration scene. Brigham Young ends up having like this scene where he looks and sounds like Joseph Smith, and eyewitnesses claim this. The eyewitnesses of the golden plates. There's so much stuff that he gets into, and he uses it against Christianity in a way to point out, like, you don't accept this. They were persecuted. They had visions. They had eyewitnesses. They even had a better scenario where the reverse of Paul happens. And the difference is that Paul converts to the religion. There are people who left Joseph Smith's church who still swore they saw the golden plates. They had actual appearances of the golden plates, and yet they still hold to what they saw, but they think that Joseph Smith is a fallen prophet, so they don't believe him anymore. Fun stuff. Watching Trent deal with that was even more fun, I think. Jacob thinks there's an original Paul, and Paul of the letters is a later retcon. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to make of all this. You know, the idea is that the letters of Paul are all late. The idea is that some of them might be early, and that there are later forgery, which is like the consensus view that the pastorals and some of the material might be written later in the name of Paul, and it's not really written by Paul. Consensus is there, but when you read Nina Livesey's book, you do walk away going, why did we die on the hill about these 7? You know, we have these 7, like, you can't question the 7. Wade Rogers says the fake letters of Paul have less sophisticated Greek than the real letters. The writing styles don't match up. That's been an observation for a long time that scholars have pointed to. Yep, you're helping me out with the Brigham. All right. He's like, hey, you know how Mormonism is funny? Ha ha ha. The believer is all happy to take the bait and affirm that Mormonism is such and such. Then we silly pants. Thanks, Kent. Yeah, they do have different writing styles. A lot of them are saying that. Yep. All right, fam. I'm going to go eat some dinner. I love you. Thank you for the super chats, for the comments, questions. Be sure to like the video. Drop a like and a comment after the live stream's up. If you haven't already, subscribe, hit the bell, join the Patreon. We can use your help. I'm telling you, we can use your help more now than ever. And never forget, we are Myth Vision.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.